Imagine the halls of the White House at midnight. The gas lamps glow faintly, their light flickering across the heavy velvet curtains, and the polished wood floors that echo with every footfall. Outside, the winds of April rustle the branches of elms, carrying with them the scent of rain and the distant creak of wagons along Pennsylvania Avenue. Inside, most have gone to bed, aides, guards, cooks, and clerks, their day's duties set aside in the quiet rhythm of sleep. But one man remains awake. Tall, solemn, and solitary, he paces softly beneath the high ceilings of the presidential residence. His thoughts are far from finished. His mind is not yet ready to rest. But this isn't the story you've heard in textbooks or thunderous documentaries. There are no battle maps here, no speeches delivered to crowds beneath bunting and flags, no shouting, no celebration, no gunshots. He is Abraham Lincoln, and he cannot sleep. Welcome back to Echo, where we invite you to journey through time, not to be excited, but to be soothed. Tonight, we'll take a soft step into the quiet, shadowed world of one of the most storied figures in American history. But beyond the political achievements and the thunder of the Civil War, there was a quieter Lincoln, a man who often stood alone in the hush of night, deep in thought, wrapped in shadows and silence. Between action and thought, between daylight and darkness, between waking and sleep, he suffered the loss of a beloved child. He carried the weight of a divided nation. What did his evenings look like? How did he wind down from the noise of governance? What did he write? What did he read? And what did he ponder as the Capitol dimmed around him? We'll look at the beliefs of the era, the mysticism of his wife, Mary Todd, and the subtle ways in which grief softened the boundaries between reality and imagination. And in the final weeks of his life, he dreamed of death. Not metaphorically, but in dreams he described to others with uncanny detail. Strange, solemn visions that Lincoln described to his aides and cabinet members. The ship dream, the funeral dream. Dreams that now seem chilling in hindsight, and yet, at the time, were simply fragments of a restless mind trying to make sense of the world. How Lincoln held the fate of a nation in his hands, yet often wandered the halls of power with no one beside him. His grief for Willie, his long, silent nights, his sense that the end was near, not with fear, but with a kind of tired grace. Tonight, we'll be wandering through the silent corridors of Abraham Lincoln's nights. We will listen to what kept him awake. We will drift with him into dreams, and we will explore the mysteries that lingered in his mind as the world around him changed forever. Let the sound of history become the rhythm of your breath. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, is remembered by most as a figure of resolve, brilliance, and tragedy. In this gentle, nighttime journey, we won't dwell in the horror of war, but rather in the subtle spaces between. Through 4 segments, each unfolding like the turning of pages in a forgotten book, we'll begin with a soft immersion into Lincoln's daily night routine in the White House. From there, we'll glide deeper into the dreams themselves. Next, we'll explore Lincoln the Dreamer, not just the political icon, but the man who pondered fate, mortality, and the unseen. And finally, we'll close with the contemplative contrast, the solitude of power. How Lincoln held the fate of a nation in his hands, yet often wandered the halls of power with no one beside him. His grief for Willie, his long, silent nights, his sense that the end was near, not with fear, but with a kind of tired grace. This is not a tale of action. It is a meditation on stillness. This is not a story about a president. It is the story of a man, alone with his thoughts, while the world changed around him. So, wherever you are, whether tucked into bed, resting on the couch, or closing your eyes during a quiet moment of stillness, allow your body to settle. Breathe slowly. Let your muscles soften. Let the lights of today fade behind you. And step with me, gently, into the past. The clocks are ticking in the White House. The fire is low. Lincoln is awake, and so are you, but not for long. Imagine yourself in a house that never sleeps, yet often dreams. It is after midnight, and the White House, that stately, storied mansion on Pennsylvania Avenue, breathes in silence. The bustle of the day has long subsided. The clerks and pages, the secretaries and soldiers, the hurried steps of policy and persuasion, all have dissolved into slumber. Upon it lay scattered notes, a few folded letters, and always a well-worn copy of Shakespeare. Lincoln loved to quote him aloud when alone, not for audience or approval, but for rhythm and solace. The words, often from Hamlet or Macbeth, rolled gently from his lips like incantations against sorrow. He read slowly, often whispering passages again and again, until the syllables dissolved into stillness. The poetry was his companion, his tether to something eternal, beyond the war, the chaos, the unbearable choices. He was not a man of haste, nor one who sought refuge in distractions. He lingered in ideas. He let his mind wander where others would flee. As the household around him descended into rest, Lincoln would remain at his worn writing desk, his long legs curled beneath him, the fabric of his coat gathering in soft folds around the wooden chair. His shoulders, hunched and heavy with burden, cast a crooked silhouette against the orange glow of the lamp. His hands, those long bony hands, would rest momentarily on his knees, then lift to his face, covering his eyes, pressing into his temples. Then, almost without sound, he would reach for a sheet of paper and begin again to write. Even the horses in the stables outside snort softly in their sleep, hooves twitching in dreams of past gallops. And yet, somewhere in the heart of the house, a single lamp glows. Its light flickers gently against the tall windows, stretching shadows long across the floor. That lamp burns in the office of the president. Abraham Lincoln is still awake. A home of grandeur and ghosts, where the echoes of power float quietly through its halls like dust caught in candlelight. He often was at this hour. For Lincoln, nightfall brought not only a pause from duty, but a stirring of deeper thoughts, thoughts that needed the hush of darkness to unfold. The desk bore many marks, scratches from quills, candle wax drops hardened into little milky hills, corners softened from years of elbows and leaning. Upon it lay scattered notes, a few folded letters, and always a well-worn copy of Shakespeare. Lincoln loved to quote him aloud when alone, not for audience or approval, but for rhythm and solace. The words, often from Hamlet or Macbeth, rolled gently from his lips like incantations against sorrow. He read slowly, often whispering passages again and again, until the syllables dissolved into stillness. A clock on the mantel, a gift from an earlier administration, ticked with a slow, comforting pulse. The brass pendulum inside swung like the breath of time itself, marking each moment not with urgency, but with calm insistence. It was a sound Lincoln had grown used to. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, when the words would not come, he would rise, walk across the room, and simply watch the pendulum swing, forward, backward, as if it too were pacing like him, lost in its own rhythm. The poetry was his companion, his tether to something eternal beyond the war, the chaos, the unbearable choices. They would not disturb him. Everyone in the house knew of Lincoln's night hours. It was whispered that he did his clearest thinking after the midnight bell, that he preferred the calm of darkness to the noise of day. Some even believed he slept only lightly, if at all, resting for short bursts in the nearby antechamber, a small cot set up with rough sheets and a single pillow. He rarely used the grander bedroom. That space had belonged, once, to his son Willie. And after Willie's passing, Lincoln found its silence unbearable. On some nights, he did not read at all. Instead, he paced, slowly, thoughtfully, from the far end of the office, near the high-draped window, to the doorway that led into the hall, and back again. each step measured, each turn precise. The floorboards creaked gently beneath his boots, though the creaks were always the same, like familiar voices saying hello. Occasionally, he would pause at the window and look out, not searching for anything in particular, but staring across the quiet lawns, toward the darkened silhouette of the city. Washington at night during the war was an eerie thing, a capital wrapped in candlelight, full of fear and resolve. Campfires glowed like low stars in the nearby encampments. From time to time, a faint roll of distant drums would drift in through the glass, like a far-off thunder. But mostly, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the walls feel closer, the thoughts louder. Lincoln's thoughts were rarely loud. They were slow-moving, deliberate. He had always been a man of inwardness. Even as a young lawyer walking the roads of Illinois, he would pass hours lost in reflection. Now, in the White House, that habit remained, but the weight of the Union pressed into it. He would recall the letters received earlier in the day, mothers begging for the return of sons, generals pleading for more troops, Congress arguing in pages dense with ink. At night, Lincoln would unfold those same letters again, read them slowly, and fold them back with a sigh. Sometimes he would reply immediately, in short bursts of cursive, his quill scratching faintly across the page. Other times, he simply sat, staring at the flame, as if hoping the right words would appear in the wavering light. The room itself was quiet, but not still. The fabric of the curtains would move slightly with the changing air. Occasionally, a servant might pass in the hallway beyond, a footman delivering a midnight message, or a housemaid checking on the fire in the east room. They would not disturb him. Everyone in the house knew of Lincoln's night hours. And when he stirred awake, which he often did, he would resume his writing without rising, composing notes with the blanket still half wrapped around his legs. His penmanship, though never elegant, remained steady. The beauty of his child's laughter, now only heard in memory. The beauty of a simple life before all this, before the weight of office, before the sorrow of war. And so at night, in these long silent stretches, he would sometimes close his eyes while seated and simply breathe. Sometimes he would shake his head as if trying to dismiss them. But to himself, in these solitary hours, he was merely a father, a husband, a reader of books, a dreamer of old stories, and a man who often wondered how all of this would end. Decisions that would shape the nation were pondered in silence, beneath ceilings lined with shadow. Words that would echo through centuries were first whispered into the dark. And though the world outside would one day remember the man, the martyr, the monument, these hours, these calm, candlelit hours, would remain known only to a few. His greatest speeches, it is said, were shaped in moments like these, not on the battlefield, nor in the corridors of Congress, but in the quiet hush of night when the flickering flame met the deep curve of his thoughts. Other times, he would lean into them, allowing their mystery to settle in his chest like a weight that could not be named. He believed in dreams, in some quiet way, not as prophecy, perhaps, but as glimpses into the soul. And his own soul, it seemed, carried many burdens. His hands resting on the desk, his shoulders drooping slightly, he would let the silence wash over him like a tide. In those moments, he seemed smaller, not the tall, looming figure carved in marble, but just a man, worn and quietly enduring. He believed that clarity of mind would manifest through clarity of word, and so he labored, always, for precision. Each word chosen with care, each phrase measured like a carpenter shaping a frame. The sentences were not crafted for flourish, but for truth. The truth, he believed, had its own rhythm, its own beauty. It was whispered that he did his clearest thinking after the midnight bell, that he preferred the calm of darkness to the noise of day. Some even believed he slept only lightly, if at all, resting for short bursts in the nearby antechamber, a small cot set up with rough sheets and a single pillow. He rarely used the grander bedroom. That space had belonged, once, to his son Willie. And after Willie's passing, Lincoln found its silence unbearable. When he did rest, it was often with papers beside him. And beauty mattered to Lincoln, though he rarely admitted it aloud. It was beauty that haunted his dreams, the beauty of peace, of reunion, of a nation unbroken. And then the dreams would come, though not always in sleep. Some came like memories wrapped in fog. Others came in flashes, a floating ship, a quiet room, a voice he no longer recognized. He never spoke of these things publicly. To the world, he was the steady leader, the wartime president, the emancipator. So much of Lincoln's presidency was lived in this stillness. But now, you know, and now, as you imagine Lincoln there, seated in the half-light, fingers laced together, head bowed slightly in thought, you may feel a kind of closeness, a gentle understanding that even the greatest among us are. There is a kind of peace in watching another person carry the burden of leadership in silence. There is something calming in knowing that you are not the only one who has ever sat awake, wondering. Not the only one to look out a window in the dark. Not the only one to feel the presence of a child who is no longer there. In the end, just people who lie awake at night, who struggle to rest, who carry losses they cannot name, who listen to clocks tick and windows breathe, who write things down just to understand them, who dream. And as you breathe now, slowly, softly, you might feel the weight of your own thoughts begin to lift. You only need to rest. Lincoln did not seek sleep in these hours. He sought meaning, a pendulum swinging in measured arcs, back and forth, creating a sense of order in the midst of all uncertainty. Tick, dot, 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 tick, tock. It was not loud, but it filled the space like a heartbeat, the pulse of the room. Time, in those hours, did not feel like something rushing forward, but something circling, returning again and again to its own beginning. Lincoln would sometimes stop writing just to listen to it, the way a person listens to a lullaby without realizing they're being comforted. That soft rhythm, constant, forgiving, became the backdrop of his thinking. Against the great roar of history, it was the sound of now. It anchored him. And in that search, he gave us something lasting. But for now, you do not need to search. The flame on his desk still flickers. Even in the deep hours of night, those quietest hours between 1 and 3, when time feels suspended and the mind begins to wander into that soft blur between waking and dreaming, the world hums. Gently, secretly, persistently. It is in this hour, deep within the walls of the White House, during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, that sound takes on a different life. It is not the booming voice of Congress, nor the loud crack of cannon echoing from battlefields far away. No, these are not the hours of speeches or decisions or war. These are the hours when sound retreats into its most intimate forms. A floorboard settling beneath a forgotten step, the creak of a distant door in its frame, the faint sigh of wood expanding and shrinking with the cool breath of midnight air. These are the sounds that surrounded Lincoln as he sat alone, long after the last candle had been snuffed in most rooms, when the city outside held its breath and the house itself seemed to listen. The ink on his page is drying. The pendulum swings forward and back again, and the president is still alone, but so very, very close. If you listen closely, truly closely, to a place that seems still, you'll find it is never silent. Begin with the ticking, always the ticking, the steady, precise rhythm of the mantel clock in the president's office. A pendulum swinging in measured arcs, back and forth, creating a sense of order in the midst of all uncertainty. Tick, dot, 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 tick, tock. It was not loud, but it filled the space like a heartbeat, the pulse of the room. The floorboards were made of thick pine and oak, and every board had a voice, long, low groans when weight shifted across them. sharp little clicks as they cooled in the night. The White House was already more than half a century old in Lincoln's time. The scent of hay and leather clung to the air near the south lawn, and sometimes a quiet snort would rise from the shadows, or the shuffle of hooves in straw. These sounds did not disturb Lincoln. On the contrary, they comforted him. Horses had been part of his life since his earliest days, and their sounds at night, slow breathing, an occasional stamp, the soft clink of tack, reminded him of simplicity, of Illinois plains and star-filled skies. A president might be trapped by politics, but a horse still dreamed of open fields. He would often stand near the window just to listen, letting his eyes drift to the outline of the stables beyond the garden, faintly visible in the moonlight. Even now, with war pressing from all sides, there was calm in the rhythm of a creature chewing hay in the dark, and it carried the echoes of those who had come before: Jefferson's soft shoes, Jackson's hurried stride, the rustling skirts of first ladies from quieter days. At night, the boards remembered. They told their tales with every faint creak beneath the rugs. Lincoln, who paced often, learned where those creaks would come, and yet he never tried to avoid them. In fact, he seemed to welcome their reminder that even in solitude, he was not the first to walk this path, and would not be the last. Time, in those hours, did not feel like something rushing forward, but something circling, returning again and again to its own beginning. Lincoln would sometimes stop writing just to listen to it, the way a person listens to a lullaby without realizing they're being comforted. That soft rhythm, constant, forgiving, became the backdrop of his thinking. Against the great roar of history, it was the sound of now. It anchored him. Beyond the office walls, the old house breathed its own stories. Outside the windows, Washington slumbered uneasily. Though distant from the worst battles of the Civil War, the capital still bore the weight of conflict. The Potomac River, slow and wide, glimmered like a sleeping animal beneath the moon. Its waters lapped gently against the banks, whispering of secrets carried from upstream. Stories of Virginia's fields, of soldiers on horseback, of bridges guarded by weary men in blue. At night, the sound of the river changed. It grew more hollow, more intimate. From the windows of the White House, one could sometimes hear the soft slosh of water against stone, or the muffled splash of something or someone stirring the shallows. Whether man or nature, it did not matter. The river spoke in its own language. And there were the horses. Always the horses. Even in sleep, the stables stirred. The scent of hay and leather clung to the air near the south lawn, and sometimes a quiet snort would rise from the shadows, or the shuffle of hooves in straw. These sounds did not disturb Lincoln. On the contrary, they comforted him. Horses had been part of his life since his earliest days, and their sounds at night, slow breathing, an occasional stamp, the soft clink of tack, reminded him of simplicity, of Illinois plains and star-filled skies. A president might be trapped by politics, but a horse still dreamed of open fields. He would often stand near the window just to listen, letting his eyes drift to the outline of the stables beyond the garden, faintly visible in the moonlight. Even now, with war pressing from all sides, there was calm in the rhythm of a creature chewing hay in the dark. And further still, past the lawn, beyond the iron gates, the city murmured. It did not sleep entirely. Campfires glowed in military encampments, and from those places, sound carried gently across the earth. The soft strumming of a banjo, an occasional burst of laughter quickly hushed, the low drone of men singing to themselves, not for performance, but to hold the silence at bay. Soldiers often sang to stave off fear. They sang songs of home, of rivers, of mothers and wives and girls they once knew. Lincoln could sometimes hear them faintly from his window. He would pause, close his eyes, and listen, not for the words, but for the longing in them. These were not march or anthems. These were lullabies in their own right, drifting through trees, caught in the folds of the night air like forgotten prayers. Then there were the sounds of security, subtle, disciplined. The night guard rotated quietly around the perimeter of the house. Boots on gravel, metal buckles clinking softly, rifles shifting against shoulders. At times, a whispered conversation would float through the window, coded, cautious, rarely complete. Lincoln respected these men, and more than once had walked out among them in the small hours, hat low over his brow, asking how they were faring. He did not fear assassination in the way others thought he should, but he understood that danger lived close. And so he moved through it, not with bravado, but with calm acknowledgement. The men watched over him, and in return, he watched over them, even in the dark. Inside the White House itself, the quieter rooms spoke in their own way. The fireplace in the East Room, unused for hours, would click and settle as its embers died, releasing the scent of ash and cedar into the air. The chandeliers, heavy with crystals, would sometimes shift with the draft, their pieces brushing faintly against each other, creating a fragile music like wind chimes buried in velvet. Storms in Washington were not uncommon, especially in spring. On such nights, when the moon was high and the wind was still, Lincoln would open the window a crack and breathe. The air smelled faintly of boxwood and coal smoke, of damp soil and cooling stone. And in that moment, between inhale and exhale, he felt something close to peace. Not joy, not rest, but peace. A fragile kind of knowing that even if the world was tearing itself apart, there remained this, a quiet house, a steady breath, and the endless, unbroken song of the night. The clouds would gather silently above and announce themselves with a low, trembling roar that moved across the sky like a great wheel turning. Rain would follow, gentle at first, then steady, tapping against the windows, sliding in rivulets down the glass. Lincoln loved the sound of rain. It reminded him of nights in log cabins, when the world outside ceased to matter, and the roof above became the only universe. In the White House, the rain muffled the distant city, wrapping everything in a gray hush. He would write during these storms, or simply sit with a shawl over his knees, letting the rhythm of the drops lull him into a kind of meditation. The storm, he often felt, was a metaphor for the war. Loud, chaotic, but finite. Eventually, the thunder faded. Eventually, the sky cleared. The drapes, long and thick, sighed against the windows, whispering as they moved. And the doors, those tall, thick doors, would creak open ever so slightly with changes in pressure. Sometimes Lincoln would rise just to close one gently, his hand lingering on the knob, as if unsure whether to shut the room off entirely or leave it ajar, like a memory not quite finished. Servants, if they moved with the grace of shadows. Their footsteps were trained to avoid sound. A soft rustle of skirts here, a gentle rattle of teacups from the pantry there. Most were asleep, but the house was never entirely still. And Lincoln, whose ears were trained to listen for nuance, in letters, in conversations, in politics, picked up on these sounds like threads in a larger quilt. He did not speak often in these hours, but he heard everything, and the quiet was never empty. It was filled with meaning. On rare nights, thunder would roll across the city. There were nights when even silence had a sound, a kind of deep, enveloping presence that filled the lungs with stillness. And now, as you listen, perhaps you too can hear it. The clock ticking in the corner of your mind. The soft creak of a chair you're not sitting in. The hush of rain you only imagine. The distant song of men who never knew your name. These sounds do not ask you to understand. They only ask you to rest. Lincoln heard them once. Now you do too. And as the president leans back in his chair, eyes heavy, pen resting beside a half-written letter, the world continues its quiet symphony. Outside, the horses breathe, the rain slows. and the city sleeps, still at war, but wrapped, if only for a moment, in calm. Beneath the soft halo of lamplight, the pen moved, not quickly, not fluidly, but deliberately, pausing often, as if it needed to listen before it could continue. The light flickered, golden and warm, dancing across the uneven surface of parchment, casting long fingers of shadow across the desk where Abraham Lincoln sat alone in the depth of night. His hand would rest mid-air, frozen above a half-formed sentence, as if waiting for the right word to arrive, not pulled from rhetoric, but summoned from something deeper. He understood, more than most, the power of words. He did not write them with an audience in mind. These were not speeches to be etched in stone or echoed across centuries. These were conversations, private, human, and full of the quiet tremors that lived beneath leadership. A mother had lost her son, and he would write, "I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement." The ink curled slowly, the hand tired but steady. He had known bereavement himself. The paper beneath his hand often seemed to remember Willie, the child whose presence still lived in the very fibers of the curtains, in the long pause between footsteps on the stairs. Lincoln's writing in these hours was not merely presidential. It was paternal. It was sorrow softened by time and by duty. Words could soften grief or ignite battle. Words could heal the heart of a mother or determine the future of an entire nation. He preferred this sometimes, especially when composing more personal letters. The flickering flame reminded him of simpler times. The prairie, the fireplace in New Salem, the smell of tallow and ink. With one elbow on the desk and his chin gently resting in the palm of his hand, he would stare into the flame between sentences, not for inspiration, but for space. Space to breathe, to feel, to weigh the sentence he had just written. Was it true? Was it enough? Would it hold the sorrow or the hope it needed to carry? And so he chose them with great care, not for flourish, but for truth. The truth had its own gravity, its own rhythm. It could not be rushed, not even in wartime. The glow barely reached the edges of the room. It seemed to draw the world inward, shrinking the vastness of the White House into a circle of intimacy. Just man, paper, ink, and the breath of silence all around. The fire beside the desk had long since died into glowing embers, giving off more memory than heat. A silver tray held a small pitcher of water and a half-filled glass, untouched for hours. And still Lincoln wrote, sometimes to generals, sometimes to grieving families, sometimes even to himself, short, unmailed notes that helped him untangle the knots of decision and doubt. He rarely tore pages. Instead, he would cross out a word with one line, never more, leaving the trace of thought still visible beneath. He believed history should know the indecision too, that even great men second-guessed themselves, that even presidents revise. This was his sanctuary, not a grand chamber or a war room filled with advisors, but a simple space of wood and wax, where thoughts became sentences, and sentences slowly took on the shape of history. These were the hours of his letters, the hours of private truths penned while the rest of the house slept. And though few would ever see these notes in their rawest form, they carried with them the softness of night and the weight of an impossible age. Lincoln was never known for speed. His writing was measured, often hesitant. The ink paused between words. Around him, the walls listened. The wind outside gently tested the edges of the windows, brushing against the glass like someone unsure of their welcome. The letters he composed at night were often the most tender. There were nights when he wrote by candle instead of lamp, when the glow was softer still, more amber than gold. He preferred this sometimes, especially when composing more personal letters. The flickering flame reminded him of simpler times, the prairie, the fireplace in New Salem, the smell of tallow and ink. With one elbow on the desk and his chin gently resting in the palm of his hand, He would stare into the flame between sentences, not for inspiration, but for space. Space to breathe, to feel, to weigh the sentence he had just written. Was it true? Was it enough? A slip of paper, folded and tucked into the drawer, containing a phrase he could not yet say aloud. Occasionally, he would stop and read a line aloud, quietly, more to hear the cadence than the content. He listened for balance. His speeches, even on paper, needed to breathe. He said once that people remember the music of your words, even if they forget the meaning. And so he gave them music, not loud, not bright, but deep and slow and true. A sentence for a future speech, a line that haunted him. He would hold a letter in his hand, reading as he walked, lips moving soundlessly. Then he would return to the chair, take a deep breath, and begin another. He kept many of them. Children's notes, veterans' confessions, ministers' warnings, farmers' pleas. His desk drawer was full of their voices. And when the night was especially quiet, he would open one and read it slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. These letters reminded him why he led, why he endured, why sleep, though precious, could wait. The stack of finished letters grew slowly beside him, like stones laid one by one to build a quiet bridge across time. Each letter a footstep, each word a mark in the sand. A thought too uncertain to share, yet too meaningful to forget. But he often folded the letters with care, creasing the paper with both hands, as if tucking something fragile into an envelope, not just of paper, but of hope. And though his own hands were tired, the letters never trembled. They held his steadiness. They carried it forward. These pieces became the seeds of greatness, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Words that would find their place months later, but first lived here, in the dim glow of a single lamp, scribbled at a desk while the world slept. Their correspondence was complicated, full of affection, anxiety, grief. He kept her letters in a separate box, tied with ribbon, tucked away in a drawer, only he opened. And on nights when his heart felt too quiet, he would open one and run his fingers slowly along the lines, tracing not just the ink, but the feeling beneath it. She grieved Willie deeply, more openly than he could. And her words, full of sorrow and longing, reminded him that even presidents must learn to survive loss not with solutions, but with presence. Would it hold the sorrow, or the hope it needed to carry? His handwriting was never elegant, tall, angular, uneven, but in its imperfections was something deeply honest. There was no ornament, no theatrical curl, just letters that rose and fell like his breath, and words that curved slowly into meaning. Sometimes he wrote pardons for young soldiers sentenced to death, boys no older than Willie, who had fled the battlefield in terror, now facing punishment that felt too permanent. He hated these decisions, yet made them with compassion. One such letter, written near midnight, saved the life of a 17-year-old. The ink still drying as he signed his name, a Lincoln as if the full form would be too formal for such mercy. Other letters were to generals, Grant, Meade, McClellan, always careful, always respectful, though never without firmness. He disliked cruelty. He distrusted glory. He believed in results, but not without humanity. Some pages bore corrections. Others were framed with little notes along the margins, questions to himself, reminders, brief flashes of clarity. His favorite paper was thick and fibrous, soft to the touch. The ink took longer to dry on such surfaces, and he would often blot it carefully with a square of cloth, leaving the faint impression of a moment now past. The subject of his letters varied, and sometimes, just sometimes, he wrote to no one. The sound of the pen was soft, yet constant, a subtle scratching like wind brushing leaves. Sometimes he would rise and stretch, walking a slow circle around the room, allowing his body to loosen from the weight of sitting. He never used sealing wax himself. That task was left for the morning staff. On some nights, there was no writing, only reading. He would reread old letters from the people. And then there were Mary's letters. She was often away, especially in the later years, seeking solace in New York or Vermont, far from the seat of war. Their correspondence was complicated, full of affection, anxiety, grief. He kept her letters in a separate box, tied with ribbon, tucked away in a drawer, only he opened. And in that space, he would feel everything, the weight of the war, the soft rattle of a branch against the window pane, the low sigh of the house as it settled deeper into night. Lincoln did not speak. He simply breathed, and the page remained before him, waiting. The ache of his son's absence, the strain in his spine from too many hours leaning forward, the loneliness that came not from being unloved, but from being looked to for everything. The lamplight flickered gently, casting new shadows with each breath of wind. And still he sat, pen in hand, waiting for the next word. And on nights when his heart felt too quiet, he would open one and run his fingers slowly along the lines, tracing not just the ink, but the feeling beneath it. Not written for history books, not carved into stone, but written to preserve something quieter, a kind of courage that lives in listening, a kind of strength that moves not through command, but through compassion. They were the letters of a man who understood that his office was not just a place of power, but of presence. That in the silence of a sleeping house, with the pen moving slowly through the ink, he could meet the moment not with might, but with meaning. She grieved Willie deeply, more openly than he could. The room breathed once more, long and slow, and Lincoln closed his eyes. And her words, full of sorrow and longing, reminded him that even presidents must learn to survive loss, not with solutions, but with presence. Sometimes he would stop writing altogether and just stare at the blank page. The silence would return, thick and full. The house remained hushed. A single footstep from a distant hallway. These were the letters by lamplight. And as the lamp began to dim, its flame flickering with fatigue, the last line was written. The pen was set down. The page left to dry. The night held its breath. The letters waited to be read. And the world, still turning, did not know what it had just received. But you do. You've sat with him in this hour. You've heard the scratch of ink. You've felt the softness of a letter not meant for crowds. And now, as your own eyes begin to grow heavy, you may let the lamp dim, let the desk fade into memory, and follow the president into sleep. He wrote so the world might remember. But tonight, you remember the writing. It is easy from the great distance of time to forget that those who shape history were also people who closed their eyes at night and dreamed, not always of greatness or danger or prophecy, but sometimes simply of home of fields of voices long gone. Beneath the weight of responsibility, beneath the carved statues and formal portraits, lies the softer truth. Even presidents are dreamers. One he shared shortly before his death has captured the imaginations of many, though he told it without drama, without flourish. In the dream, he found himself wandering through the White House late at night. Letters rearranged themselves as he looked. The stories shifted. The characters spoke in riddles. He once joked to his secretary that his mind could never rest from the chase, even in sleep. But there was something deeper in these dreams, a reflection of the way his waking mind worked, always searching, always shaping meaning. Dreams, to Lincoln, were not escapes from reality, but extensions of thought. In the same way that he composed speeches with long silences between each phrase, his dreams seemed to carry forward his unfinished conversations with himself. The rooms were unfamiliar, or perhaps merely dim and changed by shadow. He heard sobbing, soft and sorrowful, echoing through the halls. Following the sound, he entered the east room and saw a covered corpse laid upon a catafalque. Soldiers stood guard. Mourners whispered. In the dream, Lincoln asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" And the answer came: the president. He was killed by an assassin. When he awoke, he told Mary and later recounted it to members of his cabinet. Some were unsettled by it, others brushed it off. Lincoln, for his part, treated it calmly. He believed dreams had weight, but not always in the way people feared. He had long lived with the knowledge that his life might be cut short. The dream, if anything, was a gentle rehearsal for a truth he had already accepted. Abraham Lincoln, in all his solemn wisdom and historic consequence, carried within him not just a vision for a nation. In quieter moments, he dreamed of Illinois, not of politics or campaigning, but of home. He dreamed of the small frame house in Springfield, of the way the light looked in the early morning on the wooden shutters, of the crackle of firewood on cold nights. He dreamed of the neighbors' voices floating through the window, of the smell of autumn leaves burning, of horses tied to posts and children laughing down the lane. In these dreams, he was not president. He was not even famous. He was simply a man with a family, with a yard, with the creaking floorboards of a house filled with warmth. He would wake from these dreams with a kind of ache, not painful, but poignant. The ache of something lost not tragically, but naturally, like the passing of youth or the turning of a season. He never spoke much about these dreams, but those close to him could tell when he had one. His silence afterward was softer, more internal, as if he were trying to hold on just a moment longer to a place he could no longer return to. But the flickering private images of an ordinary man in the quiet hours of sleep, while the Union fractured and armies marched, while newspapers speculated and generals strategized, Lincoln sometimes lay still, eyes closed, mind adrift, and dreamed dreams that were deeply human, small in scale, rich in emotion, and untouched by politics. These were not always dreams to be remembered or written down. Some came and vanished like dew. Others lingered quietly, never spoken of again. And some, just a few, found their way into words, carried gently into morning, shared not as revelations, but as glimpses into the softer corners of a burdened heart. In one such dream, he was walking, just walking, through a quiet grove of trees. The grass was tall, brushing against his legs as he moved without urgency, without direction. There were birds, faint and far off, their songs weaving through the canopy above like threads of music half remembered. The sky overhead was dim, as if morning were still deciding whether to rise. In the dream, he felt no fear, no purpose, only a quiet, strange comfort. There was something familiar in the trees, in the air, as if he had been there before, but long ago, in a different life. When he woke, he did not speak of it for several days, until one evening, in conversation with his friend Ward Hill Lamon, he casually mentioned it, noting how peaceful it had felt. Lamon asked what it meant, but Lincoln only smiled, that weary, knowing smile of his, and said, "It meant I needed rest." Not all dreams are symbols. Sometimes they are simply rest itself, wrapped in images the waking mind cannot hold. There were other dreams, too, more vivid, more mysterious. But those were not the only dreams. Sometimes he dreamed of books, pages turning endlessly, filled with words he could not quite read. Letters rearranged themselves as he looked. The stories shifted. The characters spoke in riddles. He once joked to his secretary that his mind could never rest from the chase, even in sleep. He dreamed of Willie. Sometimes they were walking together again, hand in hand, along a dirt path. They were, in the truest sense, the dreams of an ordinary man, a man who had known fields and loss, who had loved deeply, who had walked alone under starlight and wondered if he was enough, and sleep, where images come without asking, and memories reshape themselves like mist. Perhaps tonight, your mind will wander as Lincoln's once did, through forests, along rivers, into rooms that never were, but feel somehow familiar. And if you dream of nothing at all, that is fine too. For rest, like dreaming, is a gift we do not need to earn. These were not the dreams of marble monuments, but of flesh and breath. Let the war dissolve. Let the letters fade. You are not on Pennsylvania Avenue now. You are not in the East Room or the study. You are wherever your mind begins to float, wherever your breath becomes slower, softer. Perhaps you walk with Lincoln beneath the tall trees. Perhaps you sit quietly with him, watching the fire, saying nothing at all. They whispered of longing, of memory, of quiet hope. And it is perhaps this more than anything else that reveals who Lincoln truly was. Not merely the towering figure at Gettysburg, not just the pen that freed the enslaved, but a man who dreamed gently at night and woke slowly in the dark. Sometimes he saw his son from a distance, laughing near a pond, chasing butterflies, too far to call out to. Other times, they simply sat on a porch, not speaking, just being. He never tried to control these dreams. He let them come as they would, fragile and flickering. When he awoke, he rarely shared the details. But those who saw him in the morning could see it in his eyes. A softness, a quiet, as if part of him were still in that other world, reluctant to return fully. But there was something deeper in these dreams, a reflection of the way his waking mind worked, always searching, always shaping meaning. Dreams, to Lincoln, were not escapes from reality, but extensions of thought. In the same way that he composed speeches with long silences between each phrase, his dreams seemed to carry forward his unfinished conversations with himself. And yet, for all the mystery in his dreams, there was also ordinariness. These dreams were not political. They were not grand. They did not seek headlines or legacies. He did not keep a dream journal. He did not analyze or interpret with fervor. But he respected the dreams, held them in quiet regard, like letters from some private, unknowable self. He knew the country dreamed too, its people scattered across fields and cities, each carrying their own quiet burdens. And perhaps that's why he never dismissed dreaming, even in the midst of war. For he believed that a nation, like a man, must hold on to the power of imagining something beyond what is, something kinder, something more whole. Dreams, after all, are not only what visit us in sleep, they are what pull us forward, what call us to build, to endure, to forgive. And now, as you lie still, listening, breathing, perhaps you, too, can feel the softness of that space, the space between thought, so close your eyes gently. Let the White House fall away. The dreams of the ordinary man do not demand your attention. They simply arrive. And tonight, they arrive for you, too. In the quiet between waking and sleep, where the edges of reality blur and the weight of the day softens into suggestion, some dreams do not shout, they drift. They do not force themselves upon the mind, but rather slip in like fog along a river, quiet and inevitable. It was not recounted with fear or urgency, but with a curious detachment, like a man speaking of a poem he cannot shake from memory. The image of the ship, weightless, still, destined, haunted him gently, as if it were not a warning, but a preparation. Lincoln, though open to wonder, was a man of careful discernment. He did not throw himself into superstition, but neither did he dismiss the quiet pull of dreams. He had always been drawn to symbols, to metaphor, to the layered meanings of human experience. The ship dream, then, was not a message from beyond, but a mirror of the inside, a reflection of a man who had given everything he could give, and had begun to feel, however subtly, that the end of his journey was near, not just politically, not just as president, but as a man, a father, a soul. For Lincoln, who had spent so many nights pacing, writing, weighing decisions with trembling consequence, there was something almost soothing about the ship. It is not dramatic. There is no storm, no farewell from the harbor. Just the simple, continuous movement forward. Some of them laughed nervously. Dreams, to them, were not matters of policy. But he was not joking, nor was he warning. He was simply sharing. because in that moment, there was nothing else to do with it. He had dreamed of the ship again, and it had left its mark, not of fear, but of inevitability. And as he spoke, there was something in his tone, soft, slow, serene, that suggested he had already made peace with whatever it might mean. And perhaps that's why Lincoln remembered it so vividly. He did not rush to interpret, nor to deny. He simply let the dream exist, as dreams do, without needing to conquer it. And in doing so, he allowed those around him to witness something rare in a leader, not just resolve, but surrender. A graceful yielding to what cannot be controlled. A soft gaze into the unknown, as if to say, we do not always get to choose our end, but we can choose our way of approaching it. In a life that had been filled with turmoil, death, division, the clamor of voices on all sides, this dream offered something rare, a passage without conflict, a surrender not to defeat, but to completion. It did not struggle. It did not fight its course. It simply moved forward, as if surrendering to a tide larger than itself. And perhaps that was what drew him to it, a kind of acceptance, a motion that no longer asked anything of him, a letting go. It was in this in-between place, so often visited by those who carry too much on their shoulders, that Abraham Lincoln once found himself aboard a ship. They carried soldiers, supplies, telegrams of loss. They were often symbols of war, battered ironclads, rivers full of gunboats, the grinding churn of paddle wheels pushing through the mud of southern waters. But the ship in his dream bore none of that. No armaments, no banners, no sound of war. It was not a warship. It was something older, something almost mythic. A vessel of passage, a ferry across an unseen threshold. And in its silence was something the war could never offer, peace. Not as a passenger with a destination or a captain at the helm, but as a silent, unseen presence, watching the vessel as it moved without effort, without crew, without sound. The ship drifted forward, slowly and steadily, through a vast, still sea. It did not rise on waves, nor crash through foam. It simply glided, smooth, suspended, as if drawn not by wind or current, but by a purpose beyond visibility. He told others of this dream, repeating it more than once, describing the motion as moving with great rapidity toward a dark and indefinite shore. He was never frightened in this dream, not confused, just watching, and though its meaning was never fully clear, its feeling lingered, quiet, final, strange. He first mentioned the dream to his cabinet in the spring of 1865, days before his death. In the waking world, ships meant something very different to Lincoln. He did not believe it was a prophecy, at least not in the way some hoped. There's a stillness to that image, a ship moving without sail, without crew, without resistance, that speaks to more than one kind of departure. When he told the dream to his cabinet, he did so almost offhandedly, in that gentle voice of his, eyes half distant. That was Lincoln's way. Even in mystery, he walked calmly. Lincoln did not rush to interpret, nor to deny. He simply let the dream exist, as dreams do, without needing to conquer it. And in doing so, he allowed those around him to witness something rare in a leader, not just resolve, but surrender. A graceful yielding to what cannot be controlled. A soft gaze into the unknown, as if to say, we do not always get to choose our end, but we can choose our way of approaching it. Historians have since read much into the dream. Some see it as eerie foreshadowing of his assassination. Others view it as a psychological reflection, a man exhausted beyond words, feeling the pull of mortality. And still others find in it a kind of spiritual premonition, a moment when the veil between life and death thinned and something beyond reached through. But the truth is simpler, quieter. It was just a dream, a quiet, drifting image that came to him not in a moment of crisis, but in a moment of stillness. A vision that asked for nothing, a dream that told no story, just movement, forward. In that dream, Lincoln did not speak. He did not steer. He did not struggle. And perhaps that's what made it so powerful. After years of being the central figure in a nation's nightmare, here was a dream in which he could simply let go. Not across water, but through memory. Through the minds of those who close their eyes and imagine a man, tall and tired, watching the horizon with quiet understanding. A silence that holds meaning. A motion that needs no destination, not fearing it, not rushing toward it, but simply moving gently toward whatever shore may lie ahead. Let the dream drift across your own mind like mist. Let the water rise around you, not to drown, but to cradle. You are not alone in that ship. Lincoln dreamed it, yes, but he dreamed it for all of us. A dream in which he did not need to lead or save or answer. A dream where he could be carried, quietly, with dignity, to wherever the horizon shows. We do not know how many times the dream came. He said it was recurring, that it had visited him before every major event of the war, the fall of Fort Sumter, the battles of Antietam and Gettysburg, the capture of Richmond. But to do so is to miss its deeper gentleness, for this was not a dream of violence. It was not the imagined vision of his own assassination. It was, if anything, the opposite. It was a moment of rare peace, of motion without resistance, of surrender without despair. It seemed to follow him, or perhaps precede him, a quiet shadow at the edge of his consciousness. And while others might have found that frightening, Lincoln, the dreamer, the poet at heart, found it meaningful, not conclusive, not dire, just meaningful. It is easy to dramatize such a dream in hindsight, especially when the man who dreamed it would be gone within days. Perhaps the dream was not about death at all. Perhaps it was about rest. Rest after long labor. Rest after sleepless nights at his desk. Rest after years of holding a nation together with trembling hands. Rest after grief that never left him. Perhaps the ship was not a funeral barge, but a cradle. Not an ending, but a return. And perhaps tonight, that ship still moves. And if you listen closely, you may hear the sound of it now. Not a wave, not a bell, but the hush of something gliding. Let it carry you too, for all who have worked too long, for all who have mourned, for all who have wondered what lies beyond the horizon. The floating ship is for you too, and it asks nothing. It simply moves forward toward rest. There are some dreams that do not feel like dreams at all. They arrive not with the flicker of fantasy or the fluid motion of thought, but with the solid weight of reality, as if one has stumbled, fully awake, into a world that is both strange and known. But Lincoln told it not as a warning, nor with theatrical emphasis. He shared it the way one speaks of a memory from long ago, detached, gentle, complete. There was no analysis. He offered no speculation. And when asked how it made him feel, he only said that he felt strangely calm, that he had felt in the dream like a witness, not a participant, that he had observed the scene, yes, but had not feared it. The White House, so often alive with the noise of politics, had become still. And in that stillness, there had been sorrow, but also order, a process, a ritual, a final act already set in motion and completed with dignity. These dreams are not loud or frantic. They move like ceremony, like breath through velvet curtains. The threats had been real, and he had never flinched from them. He rode alone often, walked among soldiers unguarded, greeted the public with open ease. Death, for him, was not a foreign visitor. It had dined at his table when his children fell ill. It had stood beside him at battlefields, hidden in the ink of casualty lists, in the creases of telegrams delivered by trembling hands. It had watched from balconies and porches and pews. He knew it. And in his dream, death had entered his home, not as chaos, but as ceremony, not with violence, but with solemn procession. One such dream came to Abraham Lincoln just days before his death. He would recount it with a calmness that unsettled those who heard it, not because the story was filled with horror, but because it was told without fear, without urgency, just the plain, steady voice of a man who had long since made peace with mortality. In the dream, he said, the White House was quiet, unusually quiet. He wandered through its corridors in silence, the heavy air brushing past him like fabric on skin, the long drapes unmoving, the familiar rooms dimly lit, as though the house itself were in mourning. He could hear sobbing, soft at first, then clearer, not hysterical but solemn, like the restrained weeping of those who have already accepted what has been lost. He moved through the rooms slowly, following the sound, passing the grand staircases and heavy doors. There was no one else, only the presence of grief that seemed to press against the walls. The sound led him to the East Room, the same vast chamber where countless receptions had been held, where visiting dignitaries once gathered beneath chandeliers that glistened like frost in the sun. But in the dream, it was transformed. In its center stood a catafalque, a platform for the dead, draped in black, solemn and unmoving. Guards stood at attention around it, faces carved from silence. Mourners filed past, dressed in shadow, their heads bowed. Lincoln stepped closer and asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" And a voice answered, not loudly, but with the firm quiet of certainty. "The President. He was killed by an assassin." Lincoln did not wake with a jolt. He did not tremble or cry out. He simply awoke and let the dream remain with him, like the echo of a church bell after the last note has faded into sky. He told the dream to Mary, and later to Ward Lamont and members of his cabinet. Some dismissed it as anxiety. Others were unnerved. To Lincoln, who had lived with the knowledge of his own fragility for years, the dream may not have seemed unusual. The threats had been real, and he had never flinched from them. He rode alone often, walked among soldiers unguarded, greeted the public with open ease. The White House, emptied of voices, filled instead with mourning, the echo of footsteps on marble, the weight of loss hanging in chandeliers, the presence of absence, a visitation perhaps, a crossing of boundaries. It is the one so many return to when they think of Lincoln in his final days. Have wondered how we will be remembered, what rooms we will leave silent, what voices will speak our name in mourning. Lincoln's dream gives shape to that wonder, not to frighten, but to reassure, that even the ending can be dignified, that even in death there can be grace. Not the bullet, not the theater, but the dream, because there is something timeless in it, something universal. The man who freed the enslaved, who held a broken country, together who buried his own child and carried the grief of millions. This same man stood alone in a dream and looked upon his own end not with dread, but with reverence, as if to say, this too is part of the journey. Or maybe, as Lincoln himself might have said, it was simply the mind, in the deep quiet of sleep, doing what it must to understand what cannot be said aloud, to prepare, to arrange things internally, so that when the external comes, the soul does not stumble. In the end, we cannot know. The dream, like all dreams, remains behind a veil we can only peer through. For Lincoln, who had spent countless nights awake within those very halls, writing letters by lamplight, walking alone with his thoughts, the dream transformed the familiar into the eternal. Imagine the soft rustle of black cloth, the slow rhythmic steps of those who grieve, the gentle light from high windows. And beyond it all, a man watching quietly, not afraid. The East Room, where he had once received guests with weary grace, had become a resting place. And though he did not say it aloud, there must have been something hauntingly symmetrical in the idea that the place in which he had served would also be the place from which he would depart. Death, for him, was not a foreign visitor. But Lincoln was not interested in omens. He believed in meaning, yes, in symbols, in the poetry of life, but not in superstition. He did not see the dream as a forecast, but as a reflection, a mirror of the weight he carried, of the quiet acceptance he had begun to embrace. And perhaps that was the truest power of the dream. It did not frighten him. It steadied him. As though in seeing his own funeral, he had already rehearsed the final act and could now walk forward unafraid. It had dined at his table when his children fell ill. It had stood beside him at battlefields, hidden in the ink of casualty lists, in the creases of telegrams delivered by trembling hands. It had watched from balconies and porches and pews. He knew it. And in his dream, death had entered his home, not as chaos, but as ceremony, not with violence, but with solemn procession. Perhaps what lingered most in the dream was not the act itself, not the idea of assassination, but the feeling of silence. It is easy now to read prophecy into such a dream. The details of the dream, the guards, the draped casket, the muffled weeping are so precise, so vivid, that one wonders whether it was a dream at all, or something else. And yet, it is this dream that has stayed with us, more than any policy or proclamation. And perhaps that is why we remember it, because all of us, in some quiet hour, have imagined our own absence. He walked the dream as he walked life, slowly, thoughtfully, with eyes open. And then he woke and went about his day. The papers on his desk still needed answers. The war was still not over. The nation still breathed, fragile and restless. But somewhere in the corners of his mind, the dream lingered, and he did not push it away. So tonight, as you lie still, let the hush of that East Room settle gently into your thoughts. The dream does not ask you to understand it. It only asks you to honor its calm, to breathe within it, and then to rest. In the final days of his life, Abraham Lincoln seemed lighter, not joyous nor unburdened, for the scars of war still stretched across the nation. His secretary, John Hay, wrote of a gentler Lincoln in those final days, still weary, still lined with sorrow, but somehow illuminated from within. The sky was pale, the earth still damp from rain. As he walked its streets, newly captured and still scarred by fire, former slaves gathered around him, falling to their knees. Lincoln gently urged them to rise, not as subjects, but as citizens. He moved among them with humility, acknowledging their presence not as a spectacle, but as something sacred. He saw the cost of war, not just in the rubble of buildings, but in the eyes of people long denied their humanity. And when he returned to Washington, he was quiet, not shaken, but contemplative. That night, he did not write. He did not pace. He simply sat in his chair by the fire, the lamplight warm against the side of his face, his silhouette long and unmoving against the wall. He spoke with a gardener, asked after the roses, commented on the spring's early bloom. That afternoon, he met with his cabinet and spoke of reconstruction, not in terms of vengeance, but of healing. He did not seek punishment. He sought reunion. His words were tempered, gentle, full of care. That night, he gave what would be his final public address from the White House balcony. The crowd gathered in the dark below, torches flickering, faces lifted. His voice, always soft for such a tall man, carried clearly as he spoke of peace and the work still ahead. He called for unity, for compassion, for the slow, patient mending of a country torn apart. He did not thunder. He did not bask in victory. He simply offered direction, not to reignite passion, but to calm it. In that speech, there was no triumph. There was only hope. He stood straighter. He spoke less urgently. He lingered longer in pauses, in gazes, in thoughts. Mary Todd Lincoln remarked that her husband had never seemed so free of care as he did that week. He met with his cabinet in the morning, and later spoke softly with Mary about their plans after the presidency. For the first time in years, he was beginning to think of after, of Springfield, of books unread, of time reclaimed. He spoke of traveling, perhaps to California, perhaps to Jerusalem, places far from the capital, far from blood and law and obligation. His voice, always deliberate, had a certain quiet wonder in it that day, as if he were imagining not just distance, but renewal. But she also noticed something else, a reflective undercurrent beneath his calm. He spoke often of dreams, not just the floating ship or the quiet funeral, but others too. Dreams of his boyhood home, of familiar faces long gone, of places he hadn't seen in decades. He would describe them with that peculiar combination of detail and detachment, as though they had been given to him, not summoned from within. He was not morbid. He was not afraid. He was simply ready, and the weight of grief never truly left his frame. But there was, as many observed, a quiet ease about him, a softening of expression, a stillness in the eyes that no longer strained against the dark. It was not the calm of a man who knew he would die, but perhaps the calm of a man who knew his work, or at least his part in it, was nearly done. The spring of 1865 had arrived like a breath held too long. The air, once sharp with cannon smoke and uncertainty, now carried hints of blooming magnolia and the murmurs of peace. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, and though the war had not ended in every corner, its long shadow had begun to lift. In the streets of Washington, the people rejoiced. Bells rang, flags waved, strangers embraced. Yet Lincoln, though moved by the relief, remained composed. He smiled more in those last days, yes. He cracked quiet jokes, visited the theater, walked with Mary beneath the trees. But always there was that softness, a stillness not of retreat, but of return. As if, for the first time in years, he had stepped into the edges of something quiet, something finished. Those closest to him noticed the change. On the morning of April 11th, just 2 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln awoke early and spent time walking the White House grounds. The next day, he visited Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital. In the final hours of April 14th, the day of his death, Lincoln spent time with his son Tad, whose laughter brought a rare spark of joy. Abraham Lincoln met with his cabinet in the morning, and later spoke softly with Mary about their plans after the presidency. For the first time in years, he was beginning to think of after, of Springfield, of books unread, of time reclaimed. He did not seem finished, but fulfilled, as if some inner work had reached its close. He had carried the weight, and now he could set it down. Not because the work was over, but because he had brought it as far as he could. The rest, the healing, the memory, the dream, would belong to others. He spoke of traveling, perhaps to California, perhaps to Jerusalem, places far from the capital, far from blood and law and obligation. His voice, always deliberate, had a certain quiet wonder in it that day, as if he were imagining not just distance, but renewal. That evening, they attended Ford's Theater. The play, Our American Cousin, was a comedy, light, humorous, the kind of diversion Lincoln rarely allowed himself. He entered the theater with a gentle smile, bowed to the audience, and settled into the presidential box with Mary at his side. The flag-draped balcony glowed softly in the gaslight. Below, the audience laughed and clapped, the orchestra hummed, the actors moved about the stage. Let the weight lift. Let the war end, if only for now. Let the pages close gently. The scent of lilacs drifted through the city's streets. Warm breezes rustled the freshly budded trees along the avenues. His tall frame moved slowly through familiar motions. He placed his spectacles in his coat pocket, adjusted his collar without a mirror. Inside, the audience gathered in anticipation, feeling the wooden pews with the rustling sound of programs and whispered conversations. The chandeliers glowed softly, warming the velvet curtains and painted proscenium in hues of amber. Children fidgeted in their seats. The orchestra tuned gently below. And then, just before the second act, the doors opened at the rear of the house, and all heads turned as the President of the United States entered. The crowd rose to its feet. Applause rippled through the room, not thunderous, but reverent. The kind of applause born not from celebrity, but from gratitude. Lincoln paused for a moment, his hand gently pressing against Mary's as he offered a slight bow. No speech, no wave, just a quiet acknowledgement of the people before him, and laced his fingers behind his back for a moment, standing still. The box had been decorated with care, bunting along the railing, flowers arranged in discreet vases. From there, Lincoln could see the stage clearly, and the audience could see him. But even as the play resumed, few eyes stayed fixed on the actors. Many glanced again and again toward the tall figure seated above, his profile outlined against the glow of gaslight. He looked tired, some noted, but not with the heaviness of despair. Rather, with the weariness of someone nearing the end of a long, painful journey. He laughed at the jokes, softly, rarely aloud. He leaned toward Mary occasionally, murmuring a comment or a question. They did not hold hands, but their shoulders touched. To their left sat Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, young, well-dressed, full of admiration for the president. The box was filled with warmth, with gentleness, with the human presence of a night out after years of war. Mary joined him. She wore a gown of deep velvet, her hair pinned with careful attention. They exchanged only a few words. Theirs was a marriage lined with sorrows, but also with deep, quiet bonds, not always seen, but felt. As they stepped into the carriage and rode through the streets, onlookers tipped hats, smiled, called his name. He nodded gently. There was no formality in it. Just a man on his way to the theater, escorted by the fading gold of twilight. The war, though not formally ended, had passed its great climax. Lee had surrendered. The streets were filled not with marching troops, but with children chasing hoops and couples strolling with unclenched hands. Abraham Lincoln had risen early that morning. He met with his cabinet, shared a carriage ride with Mary, and smiled more than he had in months. There was no hint of dread, no visible shadow. If anything, there was a lightness in him, not joy, but peace. That evening, they planned to attend the theater. Our American Cousin was playing at Ford's, a popular farce, light-hearted, unassuming, chosen not for meaning, but for levity. And as the sun dipped behind the Potomac and gas lamps flickered to life, the president readied himself to step once more into the public eye, not for war, not for speeches, but for a play. A simple evening of rest, of laughter, of presence. You do not need to understand everything. You do not need to reach conclusions. You only need to breathe, to rest, to walk for a little while, with a man who gave all he had, and then finally, gently, let go. It was a night of ease, of small pleasures, of presence. And then, in the moment between scenes, in the quiet between laughter, a sound shattered the evening. The report of a pistol, a scream, footsteps above the stage. Panic. The dream had ended. The vessel had arrived at shore. But in these final days, before the theater, before the bullet, before the morning, there was something deeply human in Lincoln's manner, a letting down of armor, a gentle breath between chapters. And so tonight, as you lie here in the soft hush of your own quiet space, let yourself drift into that same stillness. The final days were not tragic. They were tender. They were not rushed. They were full. And now, they are remembered not just for how they ended, but for how they softened, how they quieted, how they passed, like dusk, long, golden, and still. Sleep, too, may arrive in this way, not with fanfare, but with grace. The evening of April 14, 1865, arrived gently. There was a mildness to the weather that day in Washington, a spring air that carried the quiet promise of renewal. The White House was quiet as he dressed. He wore a simple black suit, the same he wore for most occasions. Ford's Theater stood on 10th Street, modest in its elegance, but beloved by the people of Washington. He ascended to the presidential box, draped in American flags, high above the audience. The box had been decorated with care, bunting along the railing, flowers arranged in discreet vases. From there, Lincoln could see the stage clearly, and the audience could see him. The orchestra played softly between scenes. Outside, the horses nickered in the mild air, their reins resting, their drivers standing idly. A man who had listened to voices of hate and poured them into a single, irreversible act. He entered the theater from the rear, made his way up the stairwell, known only to staff and actors, and approached the box where the president sat. We do not follow the chaos or trace the blood. He was laid on a narrow bed in a room barely large enough for the doctors who surrounded him. He did not regain consciousness. His breaths grew shallower as the night passed. Cabinet members arrived. Friends gathered in the hall. Mary was led in and out again. The room was dim, the wallpaper floral. A gas lamp hissed gently from the wall. And then, at 7:22 the next morning, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln exhaled his last breath. A general standing nearby said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Instead, we remain in that quiet space, the moments before, the moments where Lincoln's eyes rested gently on the stage, where his breathing slowed, where his hand touched his wife's sleeve, where the laughter of the crowd wrapped him in something warm and familiar, not the panic, not the pain, but the calm that came before, the softness of presence, the warmth of the final hour. History remembers the shot, but we here, in this stillness, remember the man, seated in shadow, watching the stage, at peace. He did not see his assassin. He did not hear the name. He heard only the lines of a play, the rustle of velvet, the hum of a room full of people finally at peace. He knew joy in that moment. And then silence. He had visited this very box before. He knew its layout. He had timed the play. He had chosen the line that would provoke laughter loud enough to mask a gunshot. And so he waited. And so he watched. The stars began to pierce through the haze of gaslight above the rooftops. It was a good night, a kind night, the sort of evening that slips easily into memory, if it is allowed to finish. But even as the play resumed, few eyes stayed fixed on the actors. Many glanced again and again toward the tall figure seated above, his profile outlined against the glow of gaslight. The sound was sharp, a crack of thunder in a calm sky. For a moment, there was silence, the kind of silence that comes not from quiet, but from disbelief. Then a scream, a struggle. Rathbone lunged, was stabbed. Clara cried out. The assassin leapt from the box, caught his foot in the flag, tumbled to the stage below, and stood with dramatic flair before fleeing into the dark. The audience sat stunned, frozen. Gaslight flickered. Somewhere, someone called for a doctor. On the floor above, Mary wept. Lincoln did not move. He looked tired, some noted, but not with the heaviness of despair. Rather, with the weariness of someone nearing the end of a long, painful journey. He laughed at the jokes, softly, rarely aloud. He leaned toward Mary occasionally, murmuring a comment or a question. They did not hold hands, but their shoulders touched. To their left sat Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée Clara Harris, young, well-dressed, full of admiration for the president. The box was filled with warmth, with gentleness, with the human presence of a night out after years of war. The play unfolded in its easy rhythm. The actors delivered their lines with practiced cadence, earning chuckles and applause in kind. The house was content. But there, moving quietly through the back corridors of the theater, was a man with a plan. And then, at the appointed moment, he stepped into the box, raised a small pistol, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. But here, in this telling, we do not linger in horror. They carried him across the street to the Peterson house, a small, ordinary boarding house. But before he belonged to the ages, he belonged to that room, to that theater, to that audience, to that laughter. He belonged to the quiet gasp of Mary as he smiled at her in the dark. He belonged to the stillness of gaslight and polished wood. He belonged to the night. And now, as you breathe slowly, gently, in your own quiet room, you might feel the hush of that theater settling around you. The play was not finished, but he was. And that, somehow, is enough. Sleep now. The curtain has fallen. The lights have dimmed. The president rests. And so may you. Abraham Lincoln was at his core a man who thought in pictures. Not the grand painted kind that fill history books, but the quiet internal images that flicker behind the eyes of one who listens more than he speaks. The split rails of his youth, the vast prairies of Illinois, the slow bending of a river. These were not mere landscapes to him, but metaphors waiting to be understood. The way a tree curved toward light, the way footsteps left prints in snow and disappeared by morning. When his beloved son Willie died in 1862, Lincoln withdrew into a silence deeper than many understood. He told tales of farmers and fences, of preachers and barrels of cider, of dogs chasing wagons and boys with two big boots. In writing to a widow who had lost multiple sons in the war, he did not offer political reassurance. He wrote instead of the solemn pride that must be hers, not joy, not even comfort, but pride, solemn, still, quiet. That choice of words speaks to a man who understands the symbolic weight of sacrifice, not as glory, but as grief wrapped in dignity. He did not write to fix pain. He wrote to witness it. These were not just folksy anecdotes. They were keys, simple on the surface, but unlocking deeper understanding if one chose to look. In telling stories, he gave others the freedom to find meaning for themselves. He was never didactic. He was never forceful. He believed in the power of story, not to win arguments, but to plant seeds. He visited the crypt alone, sometimes late at night. He did not speak much of the loss, but when he did, he reached not for theology, but for metaphor. Not content to simply remember them as curiosities, Lincoln reflected on them as symbols, images with meaning that exceeded logic. The floating ship, the White House funeral, these were not puzzles to be solved. They were metaphors to be carried. He believed, quietly, that dreams had something to say, not as prophecy, but as poetry. And poetry, after all, was how he met the world, even if his pen rarely called it such. He said once that death was like a home that one leaves without telling anyone, and yet, one day, everyone would arrive there and find it familiar. That is how he thought, not in declarations, but in images. Not in conclusions, but in soft sketches. These things mattered to Lincoln, not in the way they matter to a poet trying to impress, but in the quiet way they matter to someone who spends long hours alone, turning over thoughts as if by candlelight. He was not a philosopher in title, but in temperament. He saw the world through layers. When others saw mud, he saw movement. When others heard thunder, he heard time announcing itself. And when others read a letter, he read the space between the lines. He lived in symbols. He breathed in metaphor. Long before he was called president, long before the weight of a nation settled onto his tall. His speeches, still studied today, are not remembered merely for their argument, but for their architecture. He did not construct them as orations to dominate. He built them as bridges, inviting the listener to walk across with him. Consider the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago? Not in 1776. Not 87 years back, but a phrase wrapped in the fabric of an older tongue, biblical, almost whispered. He invoked time not as fact, but as rhythm. And then, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. Repetition not for emphasis, but for ritual. He was not simply naming a battlefield. He was lighting a candle upon it. And in the short span of that address, barely 300 words, he took blood and war and turned them into consecration, memory, renewal. That is the mind of a man who dreams in symbol and stooping shoulders. Lincoln was a mind wrapped in meaning. He understood that language was not just sound, but a vessel, that behind every word could be a story. Behind every story a symbol, and behind every symbol a truth waiting to be held gently in the palm of the mind. His thoughts did not charge forward like cavalry, but ambled slowly like oxen through fields of memory and imagination. And as he moved through life, through sorrow, through speech, through silent nighttime hours, he collected symbols, the way a child might collect stones from a river. Not for use, not even for show, but for the comfort of holding something that had once been shaped by time and water. He saw symbols in the land. This love of symbol was not separate from his politics. It was the soul of them. But his symbolic mind did not belong only to the rostrum. It followed him into private life, into grief, into sleep. Even in conversation, Lincoln would lean into allegory. He had a story for every situation, not as a tactic to deflect, but as a way to invite reflection. His letters, too, were filled with such subtle patterns. Even his dreams bore this symbolic nature. Not content to simply remember them as curiosities, Lincoln reflected on them as symbols, images with meaning that exceeded logic. The floating ship, the White House funeral, these were not puzzles to be solved. In a time of noise, he listened for silence. We mean that he dreamed while awake. He saw through things not beyond them, not past them, but through them, like looking through a window smeared with time and fog. He understood that to lead, one must first imagine, and that imagination is not escape, it is foundation. It is where empathy begins, where vision takes root, where healing finds its shape. In a world of swords, he reached for parables. Let go of facts for a while. Let meaning arrive not in headlines, but in whispers. A leaf on a breeze, a candle in a window, a path in the woods. A voice that says, not do this, but what might this mean? That is how Lincoln thought. That is how he dreamed. That is how he endured. He was not a man without flaws. He doubted, he delayed, he suffered. But through all of it, he kept seeing symbols, the arc of justice, the weight of words, the power of patience. He saw the presidency not as a throne, but as a steward's post, a symbol of the people's trust. He saw the flag not as fabric, but as memory, and uncertain futures, a republic newly born and still finding its balance between hope and history. Yet beneath this newness, beneath the marble columns rising across the Potomac, and the ink still fresh on declarations of liberty, there remained something older, much older, a current of belief that traced its roots not to constitutions, but to candles in darkened rooms, to whispered prayers at bedside, to signs and dreams and patterns in the stars. For all the rational progress that shaped the American Enlightenment, for all the debates in chambers and pamphlets on rights, most citizens, from farmers to first ladies, from cabinet men to country girls, still lived with one foot in the unseen. The spiritual world was not abandoned by the birth of a republic. It walked beside it, quiet but constant. And Lincoln, despite his reputation as a thinker, a skeptic, even a secularist, by some accounts, lived in quiet proximity to that world too. Not as a true believer, perhaps, but as one who knew its language, who understood its comfort, and who in the solitude of his grief and the silence of his nights did not always turn it away. He saw the nation not as a geography, but as a dream, fragile, precious, unfinished. The United States, freshly unshackled from monarchy and old-world faith, prided itself on liberty of conscience, on the free mind, the free man. Yet even as science advanced and railroads stitched across the continent, there were seances in parlors, ghost stories by firesides, and church bells ringing in every town. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the country in waves, igniting revivals and reform, calling the nation not only to political awakening, but to spiritual renewal. Preachers rode horseback from state to state, tents filled with songs and sobs. The Bible was a constant companion in many homes, not merely as a religious text, but as a source of law, of story, of symbolic truth. And beyond the boundaries of Christian faith, there lived an even broader set of folk beliefs, in omens, in dreams, in signs. A crow circling at dusk, a dog howling at midnight, a mirror broken, all carried meaning. Life, for many, was not divided between the real and unreal, but layered with presence, seen and unseen. They were metaphors to be carried. He believed, quietly, that dreams had something to say, not as prophecy, but as poetry. And poetry, after all, was how he met the world, even if his pen rarely called it such. There is something deeply comforting in this symbolic mind, something gentle, something slow. In a time of chaos, Lincoln saw patterns. And so when we speak of Lincoln as a dreamer, we do not mean only that he dreamed in sleep. Tonight, as you rest in this quiet place, allow your own thoughts to drift into symbols. You do not need to be a president to walk that path. Only a person. Only awake to wonder. Only still enough to notice. Close your eyes now. Let the symbols rise like smoke. Not to explain, only to be held. Lincoln did. And now, so can you. The world Abraham Lincoln lived in was young by its own measure, full of bold ideals. The 19th century was an age of contradictions in belief. The United States, freshly unshackled from monarchy and old-world faith, prided itself on liberty of conscience, on the free mind, the free man. Yet even as science advanced and railroads stitched across the continent, there were seances in parlors, ghost stories by firesides, and church bells ringing in every town. The Second Great Awakening had swept through the country in waves, igniting revivals and reform, calling the nation not only to political awakening, but to spiritual renewal. He read Shakespeare with a kind of reverence, not only for its language, but for its understanding of fate and dreams. Born into a prominent Kentucky family, highly educated and refined, Mary nonetheless held strong convictions in spiritualism. But in Lincoln's day, they were not fringe. They were part of the fabric, in mercy, not just as a policy, but as a principle older than the Republic itself. And guided by reason, Lincoln never severed himself from the deeper river of belief that ran beneath it all. He was not a preacher, but he quoted scripture with reverence. He was not a mystic, but he honored the presence of dreams. He was not a prophet, but he spoke words that would echo in ways prophecy often hopes to. And when he died, on that April morning in a narrow boarding house bed, he did not leave only laws and proclamations behind. He left a presence, a silence that lingered, a sense, however intangible, that something larger had moved through him, something old, something that had been waiting, watching, whispering through the pages of history. He spoke of the better angels of our nature, not as political rhetoric, but as invocation. He called upon a shared moral imagination, a language of spirit that stretched across pews and tents, across both sides of the Mason-Dixon, across grief and soil and time. To believe that a dream might carry truth was not irrational. It was human. It was the mind reaching for coherence when logic had no balm. And Lincoln, standing at the very heart of the nation's agony, carrying the deaths of hundreds of thousands, did not have the luxury of certainty. That whisper can still be heard if one listens closely, not in monuments or museums, but in the quiet places. A letter written by candlelight, a line of poetry remembered at dusk, the way a child dreams of a ship drifting slowly through fog. These are the places where Lincoln still lives, not in power, but in symbol, not in command, but in compassion, not in certainty, but in wonder. He walked each day through a fog of grief, and in the fog, he searched for shapes, symbols, patterns, hope, where belief and reason walk side by side, where dreams carry meanings we may never fully name, and where symbols rise softly like smoke into the night. After Willie's death, her grief opened a door that she stepped through with trembling hands. She attended seances, believed in messages from the beyond, and felt certain that spirits could visit and comfort the living. For many, such beliefs might have been dismissed or hidden. But Mary, like many grieving mothers of her time, found in these rituals not delusion but balm. The Civil War had turned the country into a nation of mourners. Every family knew a name that had gone silent. And in that silence, people listened for whispers, in dreams, in signs, in rooms gone still. Lincoln, though less participatory, did not ridicule her. He allowed her space for these rituals. He did not chase spirits, but he did not banish them either. He knew that belief, in its many forms, often softened the sharp edges of loss. He carried a worn copy with him and quoted it often. Hamlet, Macbeth, Lear, characters caught in storms not just of weather, but of destiny. These were not just plays to him. They were parables, layered with meaning. When he reflected on dreams, he did so with the same quiet attention. He did not laugh them off, nor did he place blind trust in them. He held them, considered them, repeated them, not as omens, but as symbols. And when he spoke of his recurring dream of the ship, always moving swiftly toward an unknown shore, he did not frame it as prophecy. He shared it as a man trying to understand the weight of his own journey, through metaphor, through vision. Preachers rode horseback from state to state, tents filled with songs and sobs. The Bible was a constant companion in many homes, not merely as a religious text, but as a source of law, of story, of symbolic truth. And beyond the boundaries of Christian faith, there lived an even broader set of folk beliefs, in omens, in dreams, in signs. A crow circling at dusk, a dog howling at midnight, a mirror broken, all carried meaning. Life, for many, was not divided between the real and unreal, but layered with presence, seen and unseen. Lincoln, born in 1809 in a log cabin in Kentucky, was raised amid these older rhythms. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, is said to have been gentle and reflective, often quoting scripture and old sayings. She died when he was just 9 years old, and her absence left a hollow space that never quite closed. His stepmother, Sarah, brought stability and warmth, and though their home was modest, it was filled with stories. Stories from the Bible, from pioneer lore, and from the deeply rooted oral traditions that passed from mouth to mouth in the evenings when the fire was low and the wind pressed at the walls. In those frontier cabins, there was no separation between the practical and the mystical. A prayer might be said for healing just as a poultice was applied. A dream might be shared as a warning, just as the weather was watched for signs of a coming frost. It was a world where belief was not always explained, but was lived, not as superstition, but as intimacy with the unknown. Even as Lincoln grew and his mind turned toward law and logic, he never truly left behind that earlier intimacy. Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, was even more immersed in this realm of old beliefs. It is easy now, with our fluorescent lights and our endless data, to look back at these beliefs as quaint, even primitive. When he pardoned a soldier sentenced to death for desertion, some said he was soft. But Lincoln understood something older, something sacred. He believed in redemption. And so, though he governed a new republic, built upon Enlightenment principles, even now, more than a century and a half later, and so, tonight, as you lie still, and the noise of the day fades, you may find yourself drawing closer to that world, The world Lincoln knew, there is nothing to fear here, only something to feel. The old beliefs still stir, and sometimes they arrive not to change your mind, but simply to keep you company as you fall asleep, just as they did for him. There are sorrows in life that do not shout or demand, but simply arrive, quiet and uninvited, like a chill wind slipping beneath the door just after dusk. Some griefs unfold in great public theaters, others in the hush of a child's bedroom, or at the edge of a small, narrow bed. Willie had been, by most accounts, a gentle and curious child, thoughtful beyond his years, affectionate and bright-eyed. Lincoln began to reflect more openly on death, not just as cessation, but as transition. His speeches, even those concerned with policy, began to take on a softer cadence, a weight of reflection. She believed Willie visited her, that his spirit remained near. He issued pardons not because he was weak, but because he understood the cost of every name. He held the grief of a nation the way he held his own, carefully, reverently, with both arms. He spoke of healing not with slogans, but with sincerity. He believed in reunion, in forgiveness, not in forgetting, but in remembrance shaped by compassion. His second inaugural address, delivered just weeks before his death, reads more like a prayer than a proclamation. With malice toward none, with charity for all. These were not political lines. They were the breath of a man who had walked through sorrow and come out the other side not whole, but wise. Each soldier who deserted, each family that pleaded, each mother who wrote of a lost boy, these were not abstractions to him. Sometimes quietly, sometimes as metaphor, always as presence. The dreams did not offer answers, but they held meaning. And meaning, for Lincoln, was enough. He did not need to predict. He only needed to understand. And through grief, his understanding grew not only of death, but of life. Of what makes a moment sacred. Of what makes silence powerful. Of what makes kindness revolutionary. They were echoes of his own loss. He knew what it meant to lose a son. Not a punishment, not a curse, but a passage into something more spacious, more tender. Lincoln walked through it, slowly, quietly, without turning back. And what he found on the other side was not ease, but depth. A depth that gave shape to his words, his choices, his dreams. A depth that remains with us still. And though he could not stop the war, could not reverse time, he could respond with mercy. That mercy, born of grief, became a quiet signature of his presidency, not a doctrine, but a practice. A softening of the hand that signs, a pause before judgment, a recognition of suffering not as failure, but as human. She sought mediums, attended seances. She found in these rituals a structure for sorrow, a way to convert agony into conversation. Lincoln, though more reserved, did not forbid her from these pursuits. He let her seek comfort in her own way. And perhaps, in his own quiet way, he understood what she was doing. He, too, had begun to sense that grief was not a place to pass through, but a chamber one learns to live in. And in that chamber, there are doors to other rooms of memory, of symbol, of dream. He began to speak of the dead, not as vanished, but as present in memory, in duty, in the unfinished work of the living. Consider his words at Gettysburg, less than 2 years later. It is for us the living to be dedicated here, to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. He does not command. He calls gently. He does not erase the fallen. He elevates them, makes them part of the fabric still being woven. This was Lincoln transformed, not by ambition, but by grief. He had passed through a doorway. He had learned, through loss, how to hold space for absence, not to replace it, not to cure it, but to honor it, to shape language around it the way a potter shapes clay around emptiness to form a cup. The bond between father and son ran deep. The White House, already burdened with the weight of war, became a place of echoing footsteps and still air. He did not share his sorrow in the flood of modern self-revelation. But those who stood near him in the days and weeks following Willie's passing spoke of a change. He listened more closely. He lingered longer in silences. He sought comfort not only in scripture, but in poetry, in Shakespeare especially, whose words offered him metaphors sturdy enough to hold the weight of pain. And in dreams, he began to mention them more, to reflect on their meanings, to acknowledge them as part of the human experience that binds the seen and unseen together. They came to him not with blazing clarity, but with soft, persistent resonance. A ship, a voice, a house dimmed in morning. He did not ask for them. He simply welcomed them when they arrived. The sound of Mary's weeping drifted through closed doors for weeks. Lincoln, unable to express the depth of his pain in formal terms, turned inward. He visited the crypt, sat alone for long periods. He returned to work. Yes, he always returned to work, but with a new stillness, a kind of pause behind the eyes that those around him could feel. He spoke less often in those first days. His already somber expression became distant, though not cold. It was as if part of him had gone somewhere the rest could not follow, into the room where Willie had passed, into the space where a father tries to make sense of the silence left behind. For Abraham Lincoln, grief was not an abstraction or an occasional visitor. It was a lifelong companion, a shadow that grew beside him, not with menace, but with the solemn presence of something understood without words. And it was through that grief, slowly, quietly, that a doorway opened, not one of walls and hinges, but of perception. A passage between what is felt and what is unseen, between the waking world and the world within, between loss and meaning. Grief, for Lincoln, was not the end of love, but its transformation. Not the closing of presence, but the beginning of something softer, stranger, enduring. In grief, he did not grow hardened. He grew tender. And through that tenderness, something within him turned toward symbol, toward silence, toward dreams. When Willie Lincoln, his beloved third son, died of typhoid fever in the White House in 1862, the president was shattered in ways he never openly displayed. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. He did not write long meditations on death. He did not keep journals of anguish. Mary, deep in her own storm of grief, turned toward spiritualism with fervent hope. Grief softened him toward others. It shaped his policy, his compassion. Even as he carried the burden of national grief, tens of thousands of lives lost, homes burned, fields soaked in blood, he never allowed that weight to make him cruel. And in his dreams, as always, that wisdom continued to speak. So tonight, as you rest beneath the dim light of your own thoughts, perhaps you too can feel how grief, though painful, is also a kind of doorway. Let your breath slow now. Let your own sorrows soften. There is no rush, no judgment, only this moment, only this stillness. Grief may visit, but it does not demand. It opens, it reveals, and sometimes it dreams. There are moments in every life, quiet, fleeting, easily missed, when the world seems thinner than usual, when the boundary between what is seen and what is felt grows soft and nearly transparent, like breath on glass. It is in those moments, often at twilight or just before waking, when you feel that something more might be listening, watching, or perhaps remembering with you. Lincoln's relationship with the spiritual was neither rigid nor theatrical. It was quiet, personal, a soft awareness rather than a declaration. He attended church rarely, yet quoted scripture often. These were not just dreams of ships and funerals, but of landscapes, of voices, of rooms filled with light. The moon was high, casting long shadows across the south lawn. A guard approached, surprised to find the president awake. Lincoln turned slowly and said only, Sometimes I feel as though I am waiting to be called." He did not elaborate. It remained, softly, gently, between him and us. Between the living and the remembering. Between what we know and what we sense. And perhaps that is why Lincoln endures, not only in stone and speech, but in the hush between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the moments when we too feel the veil grow thin. When we too listen for something just beyond the silence. The guard did not ask, but in those words, there is that same stillness, that same listening through the veil. You may sense the nearness of those long past, the weight of dreams not yet spoken, the whisper of symbols carried on the wind. Let it be. Do not chase it. Do not question. Just rest in its presence. Just feel its nearness. Not dread, not resignation, but readiness, a kind of spiritual hospitality. He did not fear what might be beyond. He only waited, with the patience of someone who knows that love is not erased by death, that memory does not vanish, that the thread of being stretches further than the eye can see. He described them calmly, as though they were simply part of the night's furniture. He did not analyze them. He did not preach. He simply shared. He walked along it gently, quietly, honoring its presence without demanding it part. It shaped his metaphors, his poetry, his philosophy. And in doing so, it shaped a presidency like no other, one grounded in humility, reflection, and the enduring belief that even in the darkest hour, something unseen is holding all of this, holding the sorrow, holding the hope, holding the memory, as though something in him wanted others to know that there is more beneath the surface, more to what we see, more to what we know. He had no need to prove it. The proof was in his gentleness, in the way he moved through grief, in the way he led a broken country, not with fury, but with patience. He questioned providence openly, and yet in the most profound moments, in his letters of condolence, his meditations on the war, his reflections on death, he spoke with a reverence that seemed to draw from something deeper than belief alone. He seemed to dwell in a space between skepticism and surrender, between reason and reverence, between life and what comes after. As the war drew to a close and peace fluttered just within reach, he did not exult. He walked through those days as a man finishing a long, hard chapter, grateful, perhaps, but tired in a way that words cannot fully capture. He dreamed of death, yes, but he also dreamed of healing. He dreamed of home, of simplicity, of hands unclenched. He spoke of travel, of rest, of walking the streets of Jerusalem, not with any sense of drama, just as one might speak of a place they long to understand, a place not of this world, but somehow near. And in that in-between, he found not answers, but solace, not certainty, but meaning. For Abraham Lincoln, such moments came not with fanfare, but with the hush of ordinary nights, with the slow movement of thoughts, with silence that did not feel empty, but full. His life lived in the crucible of war and sorrow was not one of mysticism in the usual sense. There were no dramatic visions, no fiery proclamations of fate, but rather, his was a life steeped in the quiet sense that the veil between worlds, between past and present, between flesh and spirit, between the measurable and the mysterious, was very thin indeed. He would not have used those words. He did not call himself a spiritualist nor a prophet, but his presence, his language, his long silences and symbolic imagination all pointed to a man who had spent many hours just beyond the threshold, listening gently through that veil for something more. It was not superstition, nor dogma, that framed his inner life. There is something deeply human in that space, the space where the veil thins. It is where we hold the memory of the departed close, not as ghosts, but as impressions, a smile remembered, a voice nearly heard, a presence that lingers in the room long after it has gone. Lincoln knew this well. Willie's death had opened such a space. In the days and years following, Lincoln moved through the White House not only as a president, but as a father in mourning. The rooms echoed with memories. The long corridors, once filled with laughter, became quiet stretches of recollection. Mary spoke often of spirits. She attended seances, believed she saw Willie's image in photographs, believed in the soft knock of his return. And while Lincoln did not speak of such things publicly, he allowed the possibility to stand. He did not laugh. He did not forbid. He let the veil remain, thin as it was. In the last months of his life, he began to speak more often about dreams, not only to Mary, but to his cabinet, his friends. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, yet deeply characteristic, of Lincoln standing by a window in the White House late one evening. The veil, as Lincoln experienced it, was not something to be torn through, but something to be respected. Even his final days were colored by this thin veil. And when he died, in that narrow bed across from Ford's Theater, surrounded by gaslight and sorrow, the veil did not drop. So tonight, as you lie still and the world recedes, you may feel the veil brushing gently at the edges of your thoughts. Lincoln did, and through that nearness, he led a nation. Through that nearness, he dreamed. And through that nearness, he left behind not only memory, but meaning. The veil is not a wall. It is a curtain of breath, and it moves ever so slightly when you sleep. To lead a nation is to carry something that cannot be seen, measured, or easily named. It is not merely the authority of office or the ink of laws. It is the unseen weight, the kind that settles not on the shoulders, but somewhere deeper, somewhere quiet. In the hush of the White House, he sat by the fire, sometimes rereading dispatches, sometimes simply staring into the flame. And yet he read them. Not all, not always, but enough to remember that this war was not statistics, but stories. He wrote letters to widows. He signed pardons for deserters who were boys too frightened to march. He ordered supplies for hospitals. He read pleas from mothers, from ministers, from governors. He remained tender in thought, in speech, in gesture. He visited wounded soldiers. He wept quietly at military hospitals. Every battle won meant more names to grieve. And still, Lincoln watched. He walked the White House at night, sometimes alone, sometimes with a letter in hand. The guards learned to expect him at odd hours. They tipped their hats, said nothing. He nodded, moved past. Sometimes he stopped at the window, looked out toward the Potomac. Let the silence stretch. Let the shadows soften. The world is quieter now. There are no decisions to make. No letters to sign. No names to read. Only this moment. Only the rhythm of rest. The river flowed, unchanged. Beneath its surface, stones and silt. Above, stars. He received strangers with warmth. He read poetry aloud. He kept his sorrow folded gently, like a letter in his coat pocket. The weight did not deform him. It deepened him, made him slower to anger, quicker to forgive. His leadership was not forged in command, but in compassion. That was his strength, the softness that endured. Every decision was a kind of mourning. Every act of leadership required the surrender of something unseen, a fragment of peace, a moment of stillness, a sliver of soul. The logs cracked softly, the shadows flickered on the walls, and the only sound was the slow ticking of the mantel clock. Now came the questions of peace, of reconciliation, of how to mend what had been broken without sowing new divisions. Lincoln knew that forgiveness would be harder than war. He knew that the real battle, the moral one, lay ahead. And so he wrote, slowly, carefully. He drafted lines that would speak across generations, with malice toward none, with charity for all. A sentence that weighed more than any order. A sentence that held the full gravity of his office and the full mercy of his soul. It was in these moments that the weight spoke loudest, not in words, but in presence. It remained, lingering in the silence that followed, in the black bunting that draped windows, in the hushed tones of soldiers, in the echo of a voice that had carried so much without breaking. Lincoln's burden became the nation's memory, not of power, but of patience, not of conquest, but of conscience. In the silence between letters, in the breath between decisions, in the ache that comes from knowing you cannot save everyone. His pen moved slowly across the page. His handwriting, always a bit uneven, seemed more so at night, as though even the letters bowed under the strain. A weight made of voices, of expectations, of sacrifices that others will make because of your decisions. For Abraham Lincoln, the presidency was not a pedestal, but a watchtower, a high, lonely post from which he observed a fractured land below, knowing that he could not sleep while others suffered. He did not lament. He watched. He waited. A comment, softly spoken, "I am the loneliest man in the world." Or, "I have been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." These were not declarations of despair. They were acknowledgments of the vast solitude of responsibility, the weight that cannot be shared, only borne. Even with Mary, even with his cabinet, even with his closest allies, the burden remained his alone. He bore. That was Lincoln's gift, to carry quietly what would crush another, to hold it close without letting it poison him. He did not let bitterness grow. He did not seek vengeance. Even in the darkest hours of the war, when defeat seemed near and friends turned against him, he responded with patience. His critics called him indecisive. But Lincoln understood what few others did, that the burden of command was not to act swiftly, but to act justly. Not to react, but to reflect. His command was not a crown, but a burden, one he accepted with humility and bore with grace, even as it pressed him into long nights of reflection and sorrow. While others moved through the rhythm of days, Lincoln remained awake, thinking, watching, listening. The burden of command was not in issuing orders, but in knowing what those orders would cost. Not in holding power, but in holding grief. And so it was that he became the night watcher, not by choice, but by quiet calling. From the very first days of his presidency, the weight arrived. The Union had already begun to tear at the seams. Fort Sumter fell. States seceded. Soldiers gathered. And Lincoln, who had never before commanded anything more than words and ideals, now stood at the helm of a country unraveling. The decisions came fast, whether to raise troops, how to finance war, who to trust. But Lincoln did not rush. He moved with careful gravity. He read every letter. He pondered each telegram. He carried each name like a stone in his pocket. To many, he seemed slow, but that slowness was deliberate. He understood the burden. He had no appetite for glory, only for resolution. And so, he listened. He sat long hours in his office, hands steepled before him, eyes distant. The generals urged movement. The newspapers demanded action. But Lincoln, always the watcher, waited for the clearest step. He waited because he knew that every decision would shape thousands of lives, that behind every strategy was a son, a father, a letter home that might never arrive. At night, when the clamor of advisers had faded and the bustle of politics had stilled, the burden settled more fully. He carried the names of the fallen. They arrived daily, in lists too long to read aloud. And through it all, he did not complain. There were moments, rare but telling, when he revealed the strain. And yet, he did not become hard. As the war stretched into years, the burden grew heavier, not lighter. Victories were not celebrations. They were reprieves. In his final months, as victory neared, the burden did not lift, it only shifted. And when, at last, the burden was taken from him, not laid down, but stolen by violence, it did not vanish. So now, as you lie still, let your breath settle beneath this same quiet weight, not of command, but of care. Lincoln bore the weight so others could sleep. Tonight, you may sleep for him. The fire is low, the pen rests, and the night watch ends, at last, in peace. It is a strange thing to live in a house so grand and so silent, a house built for ceremonies and crowds, now echoing with solitude. The White House in Abraham Lincoln's time was not the fortress of security it would later become. It was open in ways both literal and symbolic, the doors more permeable, the rooms more exposed. He had known it in grief, in the silence left behind by his mother, and again by his son. The worn wooden stairs that creaked in the same place every evening. He did not fill the space with noise or command. He let the rooms breathe. He let the house speak in its own way. Staff prepared tea, arranged papers, lit lamps, removed boots. But Lincoln moved among them like a figure out of time, always present and yet always distant, like someone listening for something that wasn't quite here. Occasionally he would nod, offer a soft thank you, but mostly he moved in quiet, filled with voices or empty of them. Perhaps you too can feel the presence of Lincoln as house, not as a monument. That loneliness is sometimes the echo of meaning. That solitude is sometimes the space where dreams find their form. That the rooms you walk through by yourself may still remember love, may still carry the scent of those you've lost, the warmth of those who once stayed. But as a place of stillness, imagine the creak of stairs, the hush of curtains, the way a lamp glows softly against painted walls, the way the night settles around you like a heavy quilt. You do not need to lead a country to know the feeling of a quiet house. You only need to listen for its breathing. You only need to allow the silence to be not frightening, but full. Like Lincoln did. The loneliness did not come from their absence. It came from the gap between the role and the self. From the knowledge that in this house, in this office, he could not be simply Abraham. He was always Mr. Lincoln, always the president, always the one others looked to for steadiness. And so he kept his grief, his fears, his questions folded quietly within, like a letter unread. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk barefoot across the wooden floor, his coat draped over one shoulder, reading a telegram in the gaslight's flicker. That same expression likely filled the rooms of the White House more nights than we can imagine. It was not a symbol of power to him, but a place of refuge, a space where he could put pen to paper without interruption, where he could reread Shakespeare alone, where he could light a fire and sit without needing to explain his silence. He never decorated it lavishly. He never remodeled it grandly. He let it be as it was, stately, worn, sufficient. He respected its history. He did not try to make it his own. And in that respect was a kind of kinship. One quiet soul abiding in a quiet space, asking only for time and a little room to think. It was not bitterness. It was not despair. It was the expression of a man who had accepted solitude as part of service, who had learned that leadership, in its truest form, is not triumph, but endurance. That to be present for others sometimes means being absent from oneself, and that a lonely house is not always an empty one. Sometimes it is full of echoes we choose to carry. Sometimes he would sit beside the fireplace in silence for hours, the logs collapsing slowly into glowing embers, the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. His thoughts moved slowly, like clouds. He was never in a rush to finish a sentence, to complete a thought. He let his mind drift between rooms, just as he drifted between memories. The long hallway to the family quarters where Willie's absence still lingered in the air like perfume. The sitting room where Mary sometimes waited for him, eyes red from memory, voice soft with longing. The drawing room where Tad played with toy soldiers, unaware of how close sorrow always stood. The house was full of movement, and yet profoundly still. Even the laughter of his children, once vibrant, had become a memory, not erased, but dimmed, like a song heard through thick walls. But in the White House, loneliness took on a different shape. It was not the absence of people, for there were always people, but the absence of understanding. The loneliness of being seen constantly, but rarely seen fully. Of being spoken to all day, and yet not spoken with. Of being needed by millions, but known by almost no one. He was admired, misunderstood, adored, vilified, but so rarely met as a man. And so the house, large as it was, became a place where he withdrew inward, even as his name filled newspapers, even as his words reached the far corners of the country. But even amid the clamor of advisors, the clink of teacups, the echo of boots on polished floors, it could feel unbearably quiet, especially at night, especially for a man like Lincoln, whose soul tilted naturally toward silence. The president's house, that great columned mansion at the heart of a nation at war, was, in many ways, the loneliest house in America. Beneath its ceilings, conversations drifted and fell like leaves. The drapes hung heavy. The halls stretched wide. The windows watched a city that never fully slept. And within, in the amber glow of lamplight and the hush of closed doors, Lincoln moved through its rooms not like a ruler, but like a keeper of watchful hours. Like a man waiting for voices long gone to speak again. He had not grown up in such spaces. His childhood homes were simple, wooden, small, one-room cabins where everything was shared. Sleep, warmth, sorrow. But here, in the president's house, each room had its own purpose, its own silence. There were sitting rooms and drawing rooms, dining rooms and receiving rooms. But the one room Lincoln inhabited most deeply was the room where he could be alone. Not the formal office, not the grand East Room, but those shadowed corners where no one waited for him to speak, where no decisions were expected, where the weight of command could be set down for a few brief minutes, if only gently, if only within. Sometimes he sat in the library, the fire casting long shadows on the books he rarely opened during those years. Sometimes he wandered the halls after Mary had gone to sleep, his footsteps soft, steady, the echo of each step returned to him by the marble and wood. Occasionally, he paused by a window, one hand behind his back, watching the city flicker in the dark, the oil lamps of soldiers, the steady lamps of the treasury, the faint glow of war hospitals down the street. Loneliness, for Lincoln, was not unfamiliar. He had known it in childhood, in long walks across the prairie, in his early years of reading by firelight. The rooms themselves became characters in his life. The red room, the green room, each with its own scent, its own echoes. And at the heart of this lonely house stood Lincoln, tall, quiet, folded into himself. Servants came and went, silent and respectful. Guards passed through the hallways with muffled steps. There is a photograph of Lincoln, taken during the war. His shoulders sloped, his eyes shadowed, his expression somewhere between fatigue and acceptance. And yet, he loved the house in his own way. Tonight, as you lie in your own quiet house, whether grand or humble, and in that silence, you may hear something, not a voice, not a sound, but a sense that you are not truly alone. Lincoln walked those rooms too. He stood by those windows. He whispered names into firelight, and he let the loneliness shape him, not hollow him. Sleep now in your own quiet house. Let the walls breathe. Let the night unfold. Let the loneliness be gentle. The house is not empty. It is listening. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a home after a child is gone. It is not the quiet of bedtime, nor the hush of thoughtful work. It is a silence that lives in doorways and hangs between shadows, a silence that never fully retreats, no matter how many days or years pass. He did not wail. He did not break. He simply became more withdrawn, more contemplative. He would sit in the chair near the fireplace, his eyes distant, his hand resting on the arm of the chair, unmoving. He did not speak to the servants about it. He did not ask for company. He simply sat, as if willing memory to take the place of presence, as if his mind could hold the boy for a few moments more. Or maybe a belief, quiet and unspoken, that the bond between father and son was not broken by death, only changed. We only know that in Lincoln's final days, when the burdens of office were at their heaviest, he spoke of Willie again, of his goodness, his brightness, his joy. And perhaps, in those moments, the president allowed himself to become not the lonely figure of power, but simply a father once more, missing his child. Not as a symbol, not as a story, but as a man sitting quietly in the dark, remembering the sound of small footsteps, the laughter that once filled these great and echoing rooms. He never claimed visions. He never proclaimed messages from the beyond. But there was something in the way he spoke of Willie's gentleness, of his kindness, that suggested the boy was still with him, just behind the veil, just beyond the reach of waking thought. In moments of great decision, one wonders whether Lincoln turned his mind to Willie, asked silently, "What would you think of your father now?" And perhaps, in the hush of those sleepless nights, he found comfort in imagining the answer. And perhaps he could. For Lincoln, dreams were more than idle visions. They were spaces where past and present, living and dead, sometimes blurred. A house where a child had lived and died. A house where love had left a mark so deep, it could still be felt in the walls, in the wooden banisters, in the soft press of a door left slightly ajar. And Lincoln, who knew the price of holding a nation together, carried that grief with him not as a burden, but as a quiet companion. A reminder that in every great task, it is the love we have known and the loss we have endured that shapes the soul of our actions. He spoke on occasion of seeing Willie in his dreams, not always vividly and lost, not as ghosts, but as memory's gentle breath. Perhaps you too have stood in a doorway, remembering the sound of a voice now silent. Perhaps you too carry grief like a folded letter, read again and again when the world has gone quiet. And if so, know that you are not alone. Lincoln stood there too, and he listened, and he remembered, and he kept going, carrying love like a lantern through the long corridors of night. But softly, as if the boy were passing through the edge of a room, or sitting just outside the reach of candlelight. And in those dreams, there was not always sorrow. There was simply the recognition of absence made present for a moment, like the breeze that moves a curtain even when the window is closed. Those who saw him in the weeks after said his face had changed again, the lines deeper, the sadness quieter, but heavier somehow. It is said that after Willie's death, he became more tender with soldiers' mothers, more attentive to the grief of others. He would hold her hand when her tears came unbidden. He would sit beside her quietly, not offering solutions, only presence. And at night, when the house had grown still and the halls were dark, Lincoln would sometimes walk to the edge of the bedroom where his boy once slept. He would pause, his tall figure half silhouetted by the moonlight through the windows, and he would remain there for long minutes, not entering, not speaking, only listening to a silence that no longer held breath, only memory. His letters of condolence grew more intimate, more personal. He understood now, not just the pain of leadership, but the raw, unyielding ache of private loss. And in that understanding, he carried his nation differently, not as a ruler above them, but as a father among them. The nation, too, was losing its sons by the thousands. And so Lincoln's grief, so personal, so devastating, became quietly shared with the grieving mothers, fathers, and children across the country. He did not speak often of Willie in public, but he did not need to. The sorrow was etched into the way he walked, the long pauses in his sentences, the distant way he sometimes stared into space during meetings, as if hearing a voice only he could perceive. He still met with his cabinet, still walked among the soldiers, still wrote speeches and telegrams and proclamations. But something in his gaze had grown more distant, more inward. as if every decision now passed through the filter of a father's grief, as if every young soldier he sent to war carried in his face some faint echo of Willie, that same gentle earnestness, that same promise of a future never to be seen. In the White House, amid the corridors of national power and the rhythm of war, Abraham Lincoln lived within that silence, carried it with him like a shadow stitched to his soul. His son, William Wallace Lincoln, called Willie, had died in that house, just shy of his 12th birthday. The fever had come quickly. Typhoid, they said. And though Mary clung to her son's bedside in frantic devotion, and Lincoln sat in stillness, unable to keep the tears from breaking loose, the sickness took him. On February 20th, 1862, the boy's soft breath faded, and with it something deep within the president, also dimmed, not extinguished but darkened, drawn inward, as though a small sun had set behind the heavy drapes of his soul. In the days that followed, the White House, already heavy with the burdens of war, became a house of mourning. The air grew still. The fireplaces burned low. Even Tad, the youngest, seemed subdued, no longer racing through the rooms with his toy cannon, but curling into corners where grief could not find him so easily. Mary collapsed into her sorrow, inconsolable for months. She kept Willie's room just as he had left it. His clothes remained folded, his books untouched. Sometimes in the evenings, she would walk through the halls in silence, stopping outside his door with her hand resting gently on the knob, as though listening for some sound from within, the rustle of movement, the turning of a page, the whisper of a boy's voice saying "Mother." But the room remained still, and the boy remained absent. Lincoln, by contrast, turned to a quieter kind of mourning, one stitched into the spaces between his duties. In quiet moments, Lincoln would return to the room where Willie had died. The loss of Willie changed Lincoln. It tempered his tone, made his empathy deeper. Mary never fully recovered. Her sorrow remained fresh even years later, and Lincoln, for all his own grief, spent much of his time trying to soften hers. And yet, even in the depth of that loss, there was a kind of peace in Lincoln's gaze. A resignation, perhaps. We do not know what words passed between them in dreams. And so, the White House remained not just a house of politics, but a house of grief. Tonight, as you rest in your own quiet space, perhaps you can feel the presence of those you have loved. Sleep now with your memories near. Let the absent be present in peace. Let their names be soft upon your heart. Let their echoes be lullabies. And know, they are never truly gone. Only waiting in the quiet. Only waiting for you to rest. The night, in many ways, belonged to Lincoln. When the bustle of the day fell quiet, when the final visitors left the antechambers, and the last candles sputtered out in the West Wing. In ancient times, they were the firekeepers and guards, the sentinels and shamans, watching the stars for signs, holding the line between chaos and calm. Beyond it lay the darkened streets of Washington, with gas lamps flickering and carriages rattling over cobblestones. Some came from widows, some from soldiers, others from children whose fathers had not returned. Lincoln read them with care, not always responding, for time would not allow it, but always carrying their words within him. A sentence might stay with him for days. The past visited him, not in ghosts, but in memories. Lincoln's body bore it, in his gait, which grew slower, in his hands, which trembled more with each passing month, in his eyes, ringed with sleeplessness. He aged visibly, more rapidly than most men, his face carving into deep furrows that seemed not merely physical, but carved by time itself. Think of the lamp casting warm light over his papers, of the slow scrape of pen against parchment. Think of the world outside his room, sleeping, dreaming, aching for peace. And know that in every age, there are those who hold vigil, who carry the weight so that others may rest. Tonight, as you breathe slowly, as your thoughts soften and wander, let Lincoln's night become your own. A place of quiet reflection, of gentle strength, of deep, enduring calm. And yet, he endured. Not because he was invincible, but because he had accepted quietly, wholly, the weight of what was asked of him. In this way, the night shaped him. Not into a symbol, not into a martyr, but into a vessel. One through which the grief and hope of millions could briefly pass, and perhaps find meaning. He saw his youth in Kentucky, the hard days of manual labor, the smell of split logs, and the sting of frozen air. It was the witness to his fears, the canvas for his dreams, the sounding board for his doubts. It did not answer him, but it heard him. And in that hearing, Lincoln found just enough strength to continue. Day would come, always, with its demands and declarations, its crises and confrontations. But the night? The night was a space in which he could simply be a man, a father, a thinker, a soul bearing witness to the burdens of his time. He saw the rise of his career, the awkwardness of early debates, the tremble of his hand on his first oath of office. He saw Mary, before sorrow changed her eyes. He saw Willie. He saw 1,000 unnamed faces, black and white, northern and southern, who would never know him, but whose fate now rested in the spaces between his decisions. And above all, he saw a future, one not guaranteed, one still trembling on the edge of possibility. A nation where the wounds might one day scar over, where former enemies might sit together at a single table, where liberty would not be perfect, but would at least be shared. A phrase might shape a policy. A tear-stained page might slip quietly into his coat pocket, where he would touch it during moments of great pressure, not as a token, but as a tether. In the deep of night, those letters became more than correspondence. They were confessions, prayers, fragments of a people asking not just for justice, but for kindness, for understanding, for recognition. And so, as the wind rattled the window panes and the fire let out its last sigh, Lincoln would return again and again to these quiet acts of listening, a kind of nocturnal communion between a weary leader and the weary hearts of his land. Further still invisible, but present lay the vast stretch of land under his care, the valleys of Pennsylvania, the cotton fields of Georgia, the rivers that marked the Mason-Dixon line, the distant plains that still carried the hopes of a westward people. All of it lived inside him, pressing in as he paced those polished floors, the soles of his boots whispering against wood worn smooth by anxious steps. He did not speak aloud, but if he had, perhaps his words would have gone something like this. Are they safe tonight, those mothers and sons, those tired farmers and wide-eyed children? Are they together, under one roof, or separated by lines drawn in blood? What have I done today to bring them closer to peace? And what shall I do tomorrow? Lincoln, in his own time, played such a role, not by choice perhaps, but by quiet resolve. He stood watch not over a single home or camp, but over a nation at war with itself. Lincoln was not a man of impulsive declarations, but of considered thought. His speeches, though remembered now for their eloquence, were not thunderous or theatrical. They were written and rewritten, often in the silence of early morning or the hush of midnight. He understood that words mattered, that they could wound or heal, divide or unite. And so he labored over them, turning phrases like stones in his mind, polishing each syllable until it shone with sincerity. The Gettysburg Address, spoken in the daylight but born in darkness, was a testament to that labor. In 2 minutes, it carried the weight of centuries. And it had been shaped not just by intellect, but by solitude, by the gravity of nights spent among shadows and candlelight. And though he had advisors and generals and messengers, when the night deepened and the moon climbed high above the Potomac, it was Lincoln alone who held the vigil. From the dim light of the East Room to the worn chair in his study, from the dusty corners of his thoughts to the soaring arc of the unfinished Union, he watched and waited for dawn. When the floorboards stopped groaning beneath the boots of aides, and the echo of arguments had faded down the corridors. Then, and only then, Yet Abraham Lincoln fully take in the rhythm of the White House, and through it, the heartbeat of a wounded nation. As the lamps burned low and the fire sank into embers, he would settle into his solitary place, not quite resting, not quite resolved, his eyes searching the middle distance, his thoughts drifting beyond the walls of the executive mansion, beyond the reach of any one man's control. In those hours when most slept, the president remained awake, not merely from insomnia or obligation, but because in the quiet hours, the burdens of a fractured people seemed to whisper the loudest. The clatter of battlefields, the cries of divided families, the uncertain prayers of freed slaves and frightened soldiers, all converged in the silence of his chambers. And he listened, not always consciously, but attentively, as if the stillness itself carried the weight of their longing, for peace, for unity, for healing. There is something ancient and sacred about those who keep watch while others sleep. One can imagine him standing by the tall windows, looking east toward the Capitol dome, still under construction, even as war tore the country apart. The letters on his desk, stacked in careful piles, often held more sorrow than strategy. But night also offered perspective. Where daylight demanded declarations and decisions, the nighttime allowed for reflection, a slower, more inward journey. In these long vigils, Lincoln was not always alone in the truest sense. The toll of this watchfulness was not small. And so, the night became not merely a backdrop, but a character in his presidency. And as you rest now, your own night stretching gently around you, think of that distant figure by the window, tall, tired, yet steadfast. Let the flickering embers fade into stillness. Let the watchman rest his eyes. The night, for now, holds no danger. Only silence, only breath, only peace. And now, as the final chapter of this long, gentle journey draws to a close, let yourself feel the hush that always comes at the end of a story told in whispers. You have traveled through the corridors of time and memory, through candlelit chambers and echoing halls, along the shadowed arc of one man's quiet burden and luminous mind, and how the gentlest presence can hold the weight of the world. Some are visible, some are silent. Some stretch back many years, like roots beneath the earth. Let them drift, not with urgency, but with curiosity. Let them imagine again the soft creak of polished floorboards under a tall man's step. The letters are placed back in their boxes, the quill set down beside the inkwell. The window is closed. The fire has died to embers. The night, long, silent, watchful, has passed. And in its place, the first golden whisper of morning approaches, soft as a prayer. You have walked with Lincoln through the long night. And now it is time to rest. The flicker of a gas lamp against wallpaper faded by history. The muffled crackle of paper being unfolded. The soft rhythm of pen strokes as another letter is answered, another idea shaped. Let them imagine a sigh, deep and thoughtful, carried not by despair, but by resolve. Let them imagine the pale light of early morning, just beginning to stretch across the National Mall, touching the trees, the monuments, and finally, the window behind which a tired figure straightens his collar and prepares, once more, to step forward into history. Others may have only just arrived. Whatever the case, know this: rest is not weakness. Reflection is not retreat. The long night is not the enemy, but an invitation to breathe more slowly, to see more clearly, to remember who you are beneath the surface of obligation and noise. You, like Lincoln, may be watching the world from a window no one else sees, wondering whether your choices matter, whether the path ahead will hold. But in that wondering, in your quiet contemplation, there is already something sacred. The stillness that you create becomes a shelter for yourself and perhaps, someday, for others. Lincoln's nights were full not of rest, but of responsibility. And yet, even in his sleeplessness, there was a strange serenity, a steady rhythm to the steps he took, from window to desk, from ink to idea, from dream to decision. And your breathing evens, and your limbs grow heavier. Know that you are safe here, not because the world is perfect, but because you have made time to rest, and in resting, to remember. Remember that even the greatest figures in our shared past were, at their core, simply human, uncertain, burdened, but always, always trying. Remember that leadership can be quiet, that bravery can look like patience, and that sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is to sit still and think deeply. Remember that you, too, are part of the long, unfolding story, not in the headlines or the statues, perhaps, but in the way you carry yourself through your days, in the way you listen, in the way you show up, again and again, with care. He did not chase greatness, nor did he perform it. He simply showed up, again and again, to the long watch of history. And in that perseverance, in that presence, he gave the world something lasting, the hope that even in its darkest hours, it might find its way to morning. His story is not one of miracles or ease. It is a story of someone who bore impossible expectations with a human heart, who stumbled, who mourned, who doubted, but who never abandoned the quiet faith that things could and must be better. You have walked with Lincoln, not the marble statue or textbook figure, but the man who moved slowly through long nights, whose thoughts drifted through lamplight, and who heard, more deeply than most, the silent voices of a nation at war with itself. He was not always certain. He was often weary. And yet he remained thoughtful, listening, writing, deciding, dreaming. Because he understood, perhaps better than anyone, the fragile thread upon which peace, justice, and unity were balanced. He held that thread not with iron fists, but with reverent care, like a seamstress threading the future, knowing how easily it might fray. The greatness of Abraham Lincoln was not born of triumphs shouted from rooftops, but of his capacity to endure without bitterness, to grieve without faltering, and to lead without ceasing to feel. As you lie here now, wrapped in your own blanket of stillness, consider how quiet can be more powerful than noise. Tonight, perhaps you too are carrying burdens. And if your thoughts still wander, as they often do in these soft midnight hours, let them wander gently. And as those images fade softly into the dark behind your eyes, so sleep now, traveler. The story has been told. The lights in the corridors have dimmed. Good night. And thank you for being here. Until next time.